We've been discussing the possibility of artificial intelligence. We've seen that, although they may not appear as soon as some have suggested, the eventual existence of artificially intelligent beings that behave like humans is likely. And when they do appear, we should likely conclude that they are conscious, intelligent, and self-aware, that they are sentient. Not only would that be the consistent and rational conclusion, given their behavior, after all, I think you are minded because you behave like me, but morally, that is the conclusion we should draw. Since we can't know for sure whether or not androids would be sentient, we should err on the side of caution. If we treat them as disposable, when in fact they are sentient, we will once again be guilty of one of the most heinous of moral crimes. But the existence of minded machines will not only raise metaphysical and moral questions, it will raise epistemological questions as well, questions about what we think we know. Consider the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. The last survivors of a human-like civilization are fleeing from the Cylons, a race of mechanical beings they created that then turned on them. Although the early versions of the Cylons were clunky, tin can-looking robots, eventually there are 13 models of Cylons that look and act just like human beings. They even give off human-like life signs when evaluated with biomedical devices. In a nod to Blade Runner, the writers of BSG have the humans call these Cylons skin jobs. And indeed, it seems that the skin that covers their body is biological. Although this technically makes them cyborgs, beings that are part biological and part mechanical, many skin jobs were able to exist among the humans completely undetected. In fact, what's revealed as the series progresses is that numerous characters who think they are humans are actually Cylons. They've been programmed with memories of a human childhood and to ignore any evidence that they are Cylons. They are convinced just as much as anyone else that they are human. The greater Cylon plan is to wake up these sleeper units at the appropriate time. Ironically, some of the characters who hate Cylons most of all turn out to be Cylons themselves. But this raises an interesting question. Suppose you lived in a society in which androids, machines that are indistinguishable from humans, were common. How could you know that you yourself were not an android? Now, you may remember your childhood and even have pictures of yourself with your mother right after you were born. But in such a world, couldn't all of that be fabricated? You might even bleed when cut. You might occasionally get sick. But all that could just be a part of the deception. You could even open up your own skull and look at your brain in a mirror. But you could just be programmed to see gray matter when in fact you're looking at circuits. The truth is, you never could know for sure. Now, as with Descartes' dream problem, you might be able to solve this with an inference to the best explanation. If the vast majority of people in your society are biological, then chances are you are too. Even if all androids think they are persons, the probability that you're one of them would be low. If, however, the proportion of biological life is low compared to artificial life, say you live in a world that Kurzweil anticipates, where androids are more common than humans, well, then it would seem that you have a legitimate worry. Without a way of telling if you are an android, all you would have to go on is the probabilities. And probabilistically, it would be more likely that you are an android in such a world. To illustrate the logic here, imagine a dark room with 1,000 hats, where 999 are blue and 1 is red. And you are among 1,000 people asked to go into the dark room, pick out a hat, and then put it on. So you do so. What should you conclude about the color of your hat? You can't tell by looking because the room is dark. All you can do is go off the probabilities. Well, probabilistically speaking, it's much more likely that your hat is blue. If you had to bet, that's what you'd bet. And so it seems that's what you should conclude, even if you happen to be the one person who picked out the red hat. In the same way, if society is composed primarily of androids that are, even to themselves, indistinguishable from humans, you should probably conclude that you are an android, even if you aren't. But this bit of logic raises another possibility that is even more troubling. As we've seen, the invention of AI would make more than just androids possible. Like will and transcendence, we could potentially upload our consciousness onto a computer and live out our lives interacting with the real world through cameras and computer monitors. Or, like Zoe Greystone in Caprica, the prequel to Battlestar Galactica, perhaps we could just create digital copies of our minds and upload them into a computer and then have them live in a purely digital virtual world. This makes us realize that there is yet another application of artificial intelligence technology: simulated worlds. If we discover that sentience can be produced artificially on a computer, then we could create entire simulated worlds filled with simulated sentient beings. They would be like the Matrix, where the nature of the world people experience is digital, except instead of having flesh and blood humans plugged into the program, all the persons would be digital, like the Oracle and Agent Smith. Think of a Sims game, you know, those games in which you can build towns and watch them progress over time. Sim games aren't truly simulated worlds. They are incomplete and the people in them aren't conscious. But imagine a Sims game where the world is complete and programs that dictate how the individuals in the world behave are just as sophisticated as the programs running in human brains. Think about the versions of Sims games where you can oversee a family. The people in that family even go on to live their lives while you're not playing the game. Imagine that the programs controlling those people's behavior replicate what our own brains do to control us. A digital world filled with such people would be what we're calling a simulated world. The reasons we would have for making such worlds, besides having really kick-ass video games, are numerous. Suppose you wanted to know the long-term consequences of a piece of legislation. Well, make a simulated world where that legislation is passed and then see what happens. Want to really know what would have happened had Hitler won World War II? Create a simulated world in which Hitler won World War II. Want a better understanding of how evolution works, or even how our species evolved? Create a simulated world that replicates the early conditions of Earth, and then watch it go. The potential reasons and applications are seemingly endless. In the Doctor Who episode Extremis, a villainous race known as the monks simulate all of human history in order to figure out how to properly conquer the human race. One of the interesting things about simulated worlds is that they would not have to happen in real time. Just like in The Sims, you could accelerate the rate at which the centuries pass. As Oxford professor Nick Bostrom points out, with sophisticated enough technology, you could simulate the entire history of the human race in just a few seconds. Another interesting thing about simulated worlds is that their inhabitants wouldn't know that their world is simulated. Not only would this be necessary for the simulation to be accurate, people would behave differently if they knew their world was simulated, but it would simply be a consequence of the way the simulated world is designed. Their brains would function just like ours and would be receiving electrical inputs just like ours. They would, therefore, interpret those inputs in the same way and therefore have the exact same kind of experiences that we do. In other words, a simulated world would not look like the movie Tron, which, by the way, like Chief Wiggum, I would never admit to having watched. But a simulated world would not be bright and streamlined with everything glowing in neon colors. Neither would it look like the Matrix does to Neo, where green computer code vaguely resembles objects and people, thus revealing its digital nature. No, the inhabitants of the simulated world would experience it as an actual physical reality. In the same way that you experience a wall as solid even though it's mostly empty space, because atoms are mostly empty space, the inhabitants of a simulated world would experience a wall as solid, even though it's entirely digital. So you couldn't tell from the inside of a simulated world that you were in a simulated world. The question this raises, of course, is this: how do you know that you're not living in a simulated world? That what you and everyone else is experiencing isn't actually a digital simulation? Just like the question of whether you're dreaming or in the Matrix or really an android, it seems the answer is that you can't know for sure. Now, you might think that this problem is different, that there is some kind of test that you could perform to determine whether or not you're living in a simulated world. In the Doctor Who episode Extremis, there is a book called The Veritas that often leads people to commit suicide after they read it. The Doctor discovers that the book reveals that their reality is simulated, and it provides a method for proving it. Ask two people to choose numbers at random, and they will choose the same numbers in the same sequence. The book claims this is due to the digital nature of the simulation and the persons within it. Computers can't generate truly random strings of numbers. They just use complicated algorithms that seem random. Because all the people in the episode are digital, they use the same algorithm and thus choose the same random numbers. Now, whether computers can't generate random numbers is actually debatable. In fact, whether even humans can do that is debatable too. But even if it were true, this test could not prove that you're not in a simulated world. Even if computers only generate seemingly random number sequences by starting with a number and then extrapolating with a complicated algorithm, a different algorithm could be used to select a starting number for each person, thus making each person's list of random numbers different. So even if you and a friend choose a different string of random numbers, that doesn't prove both of you aren't simulated people. I'm not saying the scene in which the Doctor and his companion Bill and the group of scientists all simultaneously shout the same random numbers wasn't cool. It was a brilliant plot device. But as an actual solution to this philosophical problem, it does fall short. Now, if you've been paying attention, what you are likely tempted to do to solve this problem is appeal to the best explanation. When we realized that we couldn't prove that we weren't in the Matrix, we said, but I can still know that I'm not in the Matrix because knowledge doesn't require certainty, and I'm in the Matrix isn't the best explanation for my experiences. In the same way, can't we just say that my being in a simulated world is not the best explanation for my experiences? And since knowledge doesn't require certainty, I can know that I'm not in a simulated world? Well, it turns out that the simulated world problem is much more serious than the Matrix problem, and consequently cannot be dismissed so easily. To see why, consider the movie I ask you to watch for this lecture, The 13th Floor. In the film, set in 1990s LA, Hannon Fuller and Douglas Hall have invented a simulated world of 1937 LA. Its inhabitants do not know that they are simulated persons. Fuller has been visiting the simulated world at night, controlling another person within it. After Fuller's death, Hall discovers Fuller left a note for him in the virtual 1937 world. He goes in to find it, only to discover that the simulated person Fuller left the note with, his name is Jerry, read it, and then discovered the simulated nature of his reality. The note asked him to drive somewhere where he would never consider going otherwise. When Jerry did this, he saw that just beyond the city and its outskirts, the simulated world broke down into a green wireframe model. But Hall can't imagine why Fuller would have wanted him to do this, since Hall already obviously knows that the 1937 world is simulated. Hall finally realizes, however, that Fuller meant for him to do this in the 1990 LA world that he lives in. And when he does, he realizes that his world is simulated too. Hall then meets a woman named Jane, who has been visiting his 1990 simulated world, just like he and Fuller have been visiting the 1937 simulated world. He learns that his world is just one of thousands of simulated worlds created in hers. It's unique, his world is unique only in the respect that it was the first one in which another deeper simulated world was created. Some romance ensues, and eventually Hall escapes into Jane's world by, with her blessing, taking over the body of her cruel husband. The movie ends set in 2024 LA with Jane and Hall looking out over the sea. But in the literal last moment of the film, we realize that things may still not be as they seem. And this is the question I ask you to consider. The image at the end collapses into a thin line and then goes dark, just like a computer monitor switching off. Does this not suggest that the 2024 world that they find themselves at the end of the film is a simulation as well? Obviously so. But in reality, that's what we should have concluded even before we saw the monitor switching off clue. In fact, no matter how far they go up, no matter how many simulations they wake up from, Jane and Hall should always conclude that the world they're in is a simulation. Why? Well, like with the red and blue hats, let's look at the probability. What Hall discovers is that his world is only one among thousands of simulated worlds. That means that, of the worlds that exist, most of them are simulated. There is one physical world, and that physical world contains thousands of simulated ones, some of which themselves contain simulated worlds. But if that's true, what should Hall conclude about the nature of any world in which he finds himself? He can't think the world he's in is real simply because he came into it from a simulation, because simulated worlds can contain simulated worlds. It doesn't even matter if he drives to the edge of town and doesn't see the simulation break down into the wireframe. He could just be in a bigger simulated world. Ultimately, since he can't tell from inside whether his world is simulated, all Hall could do is go on the odds, on the probabilities. There are at least 1,000 simulated worlds, but only one physical one. So for any given world Hall finds himself in, what are the chances that it's a physical one? Only about 1 in 1,000. And so for any given world that Hall finds himself in, even if it actually happened to be the real physical world, he should conclude that he is in a simulated world. In fact, Hall should have concluded this as soon as he and Fuller created the simulated 1937 world. Why? Because by doing so, they would have proven that simulated worlds exist. And if they exist, we're likely in one. Such an argument was first proposed by Nick Bostrom. Here's how the argument breaks down. Consider the entire history of the universe. In that history, either simulated worlds will be created or they won't. If they're not, then they're not, and there's only one world that exists, and that's the physical world. Okay, fair enough. But if simulated worlds will be created in the physical world, the physical world won't contain just one simulated world. That kind of technology will simply be too useful. It will be like the iPhone. Everyone will have one for everything from games to scientific research. So, in the entire history of the universe, either no simulated worlds exist, or millions of them do. Could even be billions if we factor in possible alien life. So, again, either first option, one physical world exists and that's it, or second option, one physical world exists alongside at least 1 million of simulated worlds, an entire world full of sentient beings in all of those worlds. Now, currently, we don't know which is true. If we start creating simulated worlds, however, we'll know it's not option 1, that just the physical world exists. We'll know that, in addition to the physical world, there are also millions of simulated worlds. But at that point, what should we conclude about the kind of world we live in? Since there is no way to test, and you can't tell from the inside, all we'd have to go on is the odds. But since there are millions of simulated worlds and only one real one, the chances that we are in the real universe would be 1,000,000 to 1. Just like with the red hats and the blue hats, we should conclude that we are in a simulated world. So as soon as Fuller and Hall created a simulated world, they should have realized that they were in one too. And if we ever create simulated worlds, we should conclude that we are in one too. Now, you may not think the possibility of us living in a simulated world matters since we have not created simulated worlds. But Bostrom argues that this argument, as it stands, even before we create simulated worlds, entails that you should conclude that it's about 20% likely that we live in a simulated world. Now, let me be clear on this. He's not making the mere observation that our living in a simulated world is an unfalsifiable possibility, like the possibility that you are dreaming or in the Matrix or being fooled by an evil demon is an unfalsifiable possibility. No, he's saying that there is an actual, real, live possibility that we are living in a simulated world, and we should assign it a number of around 20%. Now, it's important to note, however, that he's talking about subjective probability here, not objective probability. Objective probability is the kind of probability that people use when they're talking about throwing a die. Before you roll it, there is a 1 in 6 objective probability that you will roll a 3 on a 6-sided die. Once you roll it, however, the objective probability goes either to 100% or 0%, because it either comes up a 3 or it doesn't. Subjective probabilities, however, are expressions of how likely something is given what we know, given a set of evidence. The subjective probability of a 3 before you roll the die is the same. It's 1 in 6. But suppose you roll the die and then cover it up with a cup. The objective probability is still either 100% or 0%, because either it came up a 3 or it didn't. But subjectively, given what you know, you should still assign 3 a probability of 1 in 6, because that is how likely it is given what you know, given the information that you have. So objectively, the probability that we are in a simulated world is either 100% or 0%, because either we are or we're not. But the subjective probability will turn on what we know or have good reason to suspect. What Bostrom is pointing out is that the subjective probability that you assign to our living in a computer simulation should be directly proportional to how likely you think it is that humanity will one day create simulated worlds. And Bostrom thinks that this is about 20% likely. Why 20%? Well, Bostrom's never really been specific, but given his writing, his argument would seem to go something like this. When you think about whether we will create simulated worlds, there are essentially 5 possibilities. First, we may simply blow ourselves up or destroy our civilization in some other way before we ever get that technologically advanced. Maybe climate change caused by global warming will make the species go extinct. So that's one reason it may never happen. Second, ethical considerations could prevent us from creating them. Simulated people would be sentient, so they would actually feel pain and have rights. It would be wrong to force them, for example, to live in a world in which Hitler won World War II just to satisfy our curiosity. 3, we may lose interest. Maybe we discover that directly stimulating the pleasure centers of our brain is much better entertainment, and we become obsessed with that and stop advancing scientifically. Fourth, there could be technological limitations that just make simulated worlds impossible. Maybe it's impossible to simulate what a brain does with microchips. And fifth, That is the possibility that we actually could and will develop computer simulated worlds. Now, which scenario was most likely? Well, truth be told, we don't know. Like we talked about last lecture, humans are just really bad at predicting the future. But when you're working with subjective probabilities, lacking information does not prevent you from laying down probabilities. You can still lay down probabilities given what you know, even if you know nothing. Why? Because given that you don't know anything, each scenario is equally likely. So you should assign each one an equal probability. And 100 divided by 5 is 20. So it's 20% likely that we'll lose interest, it's 20% likely that it's technologically impossible, but it's also 20% likely that we will one day create simulated worlds. And if we do, it's a near guarantee that we are in a simulated world. So, the argument goes, we should assign a subjective probability of 20% to the likelihood that we, right now, actually live in a computer simulated world. That's probably a lot more likely than you thought. To put it in perspective, that's more likely than the die you threw coming up a 3. It's not a guarantee, but it's also not just an unfalsifiable possibility. There's a decent chance it could be true. Interestingly, Bostrom has heard some call his argument the most convincing argument for God in the last 2,000 years, because whoever the creator of our simulated world is would be very much like a god, and no one has really been able to find a hole in Bostrom's argument. As we discussed in earlier lectures, you can still be an atheist and yet admit that God's existence is possible, but most atheists wouldn't put the probability as high as 20%. Are there other things that might change the subjective probability? Sure. The way subjective probability works is that you update the likelihoods you assign when new information comes in. So, say World War III starts, or the evidence shows that we have already dumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that runaway global warming is inevitable and the planet will become uninhabitable. That would greatly lower the subjective probability that we will one day develop simulated worlds, and thus the subjective probability that we are in one. Some have argued that things like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump and the Cubs winning the World Series all happening in the same year raise the probability that we live in a simulated world, because they're all black swan events that seem to defy probability. One is forced to wonder if someone in the real world was curious enough to ask what would happen if, say, Donald Trump was elected president. Or perhaps the algorithm that keeps low probability things from happening was malfunctioning during 2016. What I think raises the probability the most is quantum mechanics. Some have objected to Bostrom's argument that the computing power to simulate the entire universe down to every atom is just unfeasible. But he rightly points out that a simulated world would not have to bother with all of that. It would not have to simulate every atom in a tree when you look at a tree. It would just send a see a tree signal to your brain. Only if we started looking at things on the atomic level would it have to bother to render anything on that level, and only when and where you are observing it. The same would be true on the quantum level. The computer would not need to assign a specific location or momentum to electrons. An equation to keep track of where they likely would be if you measured them would be good enough. It could use that to simply render them on the occasions that we happen to take a measurement. But, as we've previously discussed, this is exactly what quantum mechanics tells us. Individual particles don't have location or momentum. They are wave functions, equations, until they are measured. And wouldn't the fact that we are in a simulated world explain perfectly why they don't collapse until they are measured? The simulation knows we are measuring and thus knows it needs to collapse the wave function. What if someone had said before the discovery of quantum mechanics, I think we live in a computer simulation, and thus, that at the subatomic level, particles do not fully exist until they are measured, because the computer doesn't bother rendering them until we do? First, they would have been laughed at. And then the discovery of quantum mechanics would have been considered proof that we are in a computer simulation. Now, that's not what happened. I am not suggesting that the simulation hypothesis predicts quantum mechanics after we already know that quantum mechanics is true. That's not a real prediction. That's not how science works. So quantum mechanics doesn't prove that we are in a computer simulation. But since the simulation hypothesis would explain quantum mechanics so well, it explains what a wave function is, it accounts for the measurement problem, I feel like the truth of quantum mechanics raises the probability of the simulation hypothesis, at least a little bit. I think we live in a computer simulation should be considered a viable interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, the consequences of us living in a computer simulation are interesting. It doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist. It just means that the nature of the world is different than we thought. It's digital rather than physical. It also doesn't mean that you are worth any less just because you're a simulated person. You are just as sentient as a physical person. You have the same rights and the same privileges. The one thing it does entail is that you probably shouldn't talk about the world being a simulation, because it's very likely that if we are in a simulated world, the being simulating it would only remain interested in our world as long as we don't know we're in a simulation. If we find that out, it might ruin everything and the plug could be pulled. I could be putting the existence of our entire universe at stake right now. So, let's change topics. We've been talking about the dangers of future technology. But what about the dangers of technology that already exists? The most obvious examples are something I've already mentioned: social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Are we too addicted? Are we making our lives too publicly available? What is the effect of the constant observation and evaluation we subject ourselves to by using Twitter and Facebook? Does it promote mob rule? To explore these questions, I want you to watch the episode of the British sci-fi show Black Mirror called Nosedive. As you do, ask yourself one simple question: how likely, indeed how far off, is the future it depicts? Black Mirror is a science fiction TV series in the tradition of The Twilight Zone, where each episode is a standalone story. The only thing all the episodes have in common is that they each involve some piece of advanced technology that presents the characters with decisions that we have never truly had to face. If your new husband was killed in an accident, but could be brought back to life using advanced cloning and personality augmentation technology, would you bring him back? If you could, would it be ethical to punish a murderer day after day by making her suffer the same kind of horror as her victim and then erasing her memory? Black Mirror continually reminds us that advancing technology is always a mixed bag. It may make our lives easier and even more enjoyable. Who wouldn't want to be able to have digital readouts or TV images projected right onto their retinas, essentially integrating the capabilities of their cell phone right into their body? But such technologies can always be abused and raise new and frightening possibilities for dangerous and immoral behavior, like that technology being used to make others literally look like monsters to trick you into killing them. Just like with AI, such dangers aren't reason enough to not develop such technologies, but we must always be on our guard. In a way, by doing what sci-fi does best, Black Mirror actually is a mirror. It reflects society back at us, showing us our faults, specifically by showing us the unwise and dangerous ways that we might, and already do, misuse technology. As the show's creator, Charlie Brooker, put it, if technology is a drug, and it does feel like a drug, then what precisely are the side effects? This area between delight and discomfort is where Black Mirror, my new drama series, is set. The Black Mirror of the title is the one you'll find on every wall, on every desk, in the palm of every hand. The cold, shiny screen of a TV, a monitor, a smartphone. My favorite episode is the pilot, the national anthem. The British Princess Susanna, a kind of fictional version of Princess Kate, is kidnapped. The kidnapper claims that Susanna will be killed unless the Prime Minister has sex with a pig. That's right, sex with a pig. To completion on live broadcast TV. After failing to catch or outsmart the kidnapper, the Prime Minister finally realizes that the only way to save the princess is to succumb to the threat. The government declares that watching the broadcast is a crime, but of course, everyone does anyway. The kicker is, the kidnapper releases Princess Susanna 15 minutes before the Prime Minister even goes on the air. During the broadcast, she's literally roaming the streets, but no one notices because the entire world is glued to the TV. The moral is brilliant. You think the kidnapper is the sick one for trying to make the Prime Minister perform such a horrendous act? But the kidnapper didn't even want to see it. Indeed, he committed suicide right after releasing the princess. It was us, the public, that wanted to see it. We were so fixated on our black mirrors, we couldn't even look outside. We could actually spend an entire course examining the questions raised and arguments made by each Black Mirror episode. But for now, I'd like to concentrate on the concerns it raises about our use of social media, like Facebook and Twitter. And I'd like to start by discussing the episode I ask you to watch for this lecture, Nosedive. Nosedive is set in a world where one's social media status, in a very literal sense, determines one's worth. Following any interaction, whether online or in person, others rank you on a scale of 1 to 5, using what amounts to essentially a smartphone app. And your average overall ranking determines, well, everything. What kind of job you can have, where you can live, your seat on a plane, what kind of car you can rent, everything. The story follows Lacey Pound, a sweet young girl obsessed with her social ranking, which is a 4.2. She can't afford to move into the Pelican Cove living community unless she gets the discount reserved for 4.5s. After consulting with an expert who tells her she needs fewer likes from service workers and more from higher people, she gets an invitation to be the maid of honor for her childhood and high-ranking friend, Naomi. Lacey agrees, figuring she can get high rankings from Naomi's high-ranking friends by giving a good speech. But on her trip to the wedding, Lacey suffers a series of mishaps that lowers her ranking considerably. When her flight is canceled and she can't get a seat on another because an argument with her brother made her drop just below 4.2, she lashes out. The airport security demerits her a full point and activates double damage, which amplifies negative ratings for 24 hours. And then her lower ranking means that she must rent a Czech-speaking car. When no adapter for the car's charge port can be found, then she tries hitchhiking, but everyone just passes her by and downrates her. She's finally picked up by a truck driver named Susan, with an even lower ranking than her. Susan says that she used to be obsessed with her ranking too, until her husband was denied cancer treatment because his ranking was 1/10 of a point too low. Naomi tells Lacey that because her ranking is now below 2.6, she is no longer welcome at the wedding. Lacey sneaks in anyway and delivers a drunken speech in which she insults herself, Naomi, her husband, their friendship, and the fact that Naomi slept with Lacey's old boyfriend, Greg. The guests downrate her to 0. The authorities arrest her, remove her ranking technology, and put her in jail. The episode ends with Naomi gleefully exchanging insults with the prisoner across from her. The episode is a commentary on the unfairness of unofficial class rankings in society that unfairly keep many people from accessing jobs, houses, and even other people. It also criticizes a vacuous obsession with popularity and frivolous concerns. Lacey and Naomi are poster children for immature girls who squeal at dresses and wedding rings and the mere mentions of each other's names. But most importantly, it draws attention to a philosophical worry, one that is exemplified and magnified by our ubiquitous use of social media. A worry first articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre, centered on something that he called the look. Indeed, the entire episode could be viewed as an argument for his character Garson's line in the play No Exit, "Hell is other people." But to understand what this means and how Nosedive argues for it, it's important to understand a bit about Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre dominated French philosophy from the 1940s to the 1960s, and he's considered by most to be the central figure in existentialist philosophy. Now, I say most because Sartre himself once exclaimed, "Existentialism? I don't know what that is." Indeed, trying to put all the philosophers that are usually identified as existentialists, like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, and Sartre, and Beauvoir, and Camus, all into one category, does stretch things a bit. Generally, however, existentialists concern themselves with the nature of the human condition, things like anxiety regarding death, the meaning or absurdity of life, and the extent and nature of our freedom. And what they say about these things can be notoriously difficult to explain. Indeed, unlike analytic philosophers such as myself, who aim specifically to present logically precise and clear arguments, existentialists often make their points in long expositions with undefined terms, or even by telling stories or writing plays. To illustrate the look, Sartre asks you to imagine yourself jealously looking through a keyhole to find out what is happening in the next room. You concentrate on who is in the other room, rather unaware of yourself and your own actions. They are the objects of your perception. But the moment you hear footsteps behind you and realize that someone is watching you, your perception shifts. You are suddenly aware of yourself as an object of someone else's perception and are now preoccupied with how the other sees you, just as a voyeur or a peeping Tom. They're seeing you as that. In this way, Sartre argues, the look of others objectifies you, changing even the way that you see yourself. Perhaps smokers know the look the best. There's a look you get standing outside an office building as people pass by when you are smoking. They see you not just as someone who is smoking, but as a smoker. Not as a father or mother or humanitarian, a musician or an all-around nice guy, just a dirty, filthy smoker. And you are directly aware of this dehumanizing objectification. Of course, you may deny their evaluation, but Sartre says in a certain way, you can't. In what he calls your facticity, you are a smoker. It is a fact about you that you smoke. But you can also transcend this. You are not just a smoker, but a father or mother, a musician, a humanitarian. But the look of the other threatens to squeeze you into that box and reduce you to an object. Of course, the look can occur anywhere, at work, at home, in relationships, during sex. And especially in our day and age, you don't even need to be physically around others to feel the look. And this is where social media comes in. Because you might say that Facebook and Twitter exist merely to facilitate our attempts to look and be looked at by others. We try to make others look at us the way we want to be looked at, to define how others objectify us. That's why we post clever comments, share certain memes, and criticize particular views. And we want to shape others into the way that we see them. For Sartre, this is what almost all relationships are, a constant back and forth of people trying to objectify each other. This doesn't hinder anyone's freedom. You are not bound or forced to be what others think you are. Sartre believes that we have radical freedom, literally the ability to do or be anything that we want. But this constant fight to be yourself, to not succumb to the expectations of others and make others into what you expect, is a miserable, dehumanizing process. That's why hell is other people. We see this illustrated beautifully in Nosedive. Of course, Lacey and Naomi objectify each other. Lacey is trying to use Naomi to boost her rating, and Naomi is trying to do the same to Lacey. She thinks having a lowly 4.2 give a speech at her wedding would play great to the high 4s on her guest list. But this is what everyone is doing to everyone all the time. Not only is everyone constantly rating and being rated, but everyone is reduced to their ranking. At the start of the episode, Lacey is not a loving, hardworking, fun, young woman. She's just a 4.2. When she arrives at the wedding, she is not Naomi's childhood friend with whom she made Mr. Rags. She's just a 1.1. And something similar is true for everyone in her world. Their life is like a constant struggle to be liked. They never stop caring about what others think. Sartre illustrates this in his play No Exit, in which 3 people find themselves locked in a drawing room in hell, awaiting the arrival of their torturer. As the play unfolds, we learn what each of them did to deserve hell. One abused his wife. Another seduced a friend's wife. Another murdered her own daughter. But they slowly realize that there is no torturer. Their torture is being locked in a room with each other for eternity. And this is torture because of the objectifying looks that each bestows on the others. Garson, for example, who didn't fight in the war, sees himself as a principled pacifist. But Inez sees him merely as a coward. As one of the only 2 people he will ever see again, Garson needs her approval so badly, he vows to devote an eternity to convincing her otherwise. And of course, the implication is the condition of these 3 poor souls in hell is essentially the same condition we are all in here in the real world. We're surrounded by others, looking at us, trying to gain their approval. This is why the ending of Nosedive is so appropriate. It's almost the antithesis of No Exit. Lacey finds herself in a jail, robbed of her ability to rate and be rated. She has been freed from the look of the other and no longer cares what others think. She's in heaven. Of course, there is another person there, which raises the possibility of the look once again, but he too no longer cares. And they gleefully exchange insults. Your entire head is just ridiculous to me. Not to try to make the other conform to their expectations, but simply because they are finally free to do so without consequence. It's one of the very few happy endings in the Black Mirror series. Nosedive seems to have inspired another modern science fiction show, an episode of Seth MacFarlane's space adventure, The Orville, called Majority Rule. Like in Star Trek, the crew of the spaceship Orville explores the galaxy. Like in MASH, they offer up comic relief along the way. But like both Star Trek and MASH, the Orville offers up social commentary. And in Majority Rule, it gives a clear critique of how society uses social media. But contrary to the laments of many critics, the point Majority Rule makes is considerably different from the point made by Nosedive. In Majority Rule, the crew of the Orville visits Sargas 4, a planet nearly identical to 21st century Earth. But the crew quickly learns of one major difference when helmsman John Lamar commits a social faux pas. As a joke, he grind dances on a statue of Sargas pioneer Mela Griffindon. A video of him dancing is quickly uploaded to the Master Feed, their version of Facebook, and Lamar is soon arrested. Sargas, it turns out, is a pure democracy. No government, no courts. Everything is decided by the majority's opinion, even what medications are safe. At age 18, everyone receives a badge through which they can receive upvotes and downvotes. If you get 1 million downvotes, you're arrested and have to go on an apology tour, where you appear on talk shows to convince the public that you are remorseful for whatever you did. Only if you can stay under 10 million downvotes by the end of the tour can you avoid correction, a lobotomy that will ensure that you never do such a thing again. Lamar, of course, hit 1 million downvotes because of his dancing stunt. The episode follows his attempts to stay below 10 million and avoid correction, without corrupting the society by revealing that he's a spaceman. The episode offers many criticisms that Nosedive does not. For example, it directly decries cultural relativism, the philosophical suggestion that truth is determined by majority opinion. This idea is embraced by Lacella, a Sargas native whose dad always said the majority are the truth. But Isaac, the Orville's artificial life form, sets her straight. You are confusing opinion with knowledge. It also offers up social commentary. For example, to save Lamar, the Orville crew essentially hacks the election. They upload a bunch of fake news to the master feed about Lamar taking care of his elderly grandmother and being a war veteran to garner him support. When Dr. Finn asks, what if people try to corroborate this information? Lysella simply responds, don't worry, they won't. Indeed, people's propensity to share things on social media without first making sure they are true is one of the biggest threats to democracy on the planet, because democracy requires a correctly informed electorate. But majority rule also raises concerns about democracy itself, because it demonstrates the dangers of a mob mentality and just how wrong the majority can be. Contrary to the suggestion of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the majority, when left to its own devices, doesn't always make decisions that align with the common good. People don't vote based on careful reasoning and good argument. They use emotion, intuition, opinion. At the beginning of the episode, Lysella votes for someone to be corrected, which literally means he's going to be lobotomized, because he has weird eyes. This, in fact, is why the US founding fathers created a representative democracy. We're supposed to elect experts who use reason and weigh evidence. This is why we have a court system with, ideally, unbiased judges and juries, and a presumption of innocence to guard against the folly of mob rule, to avoid disasters like the Salem witch trials. But in many ways, social media has bypassed these safeguards. For example, people are often found guilty in the court of public opinion before they ever get a fair trial, just like on Sargas 4. Through the Orville, Seth MacFarlane seems to be telling us that we should, more often than not, just shut Facebook off, like Lysella does with the master feed at the end of the episode. Majority Rule more directly borrows from the Black Mirror episode Hated in the Nation, where every day whoever has the most death to hashtags on Twitter is automatically killed by a swarm of electronic bees. Fun stuff. But all three of these television episodes raise another philosophical worry, the panopticon. Actually, the panopticon isn't so much a philosophical worry as it is a concept that gives rise to philosophical worries. Let me elaborate. The panopticon was first conceived by philosopher Jeremy Bentham in 1791. It was his proposed design for a more efficient prison building. The building itself would be circular, with prison cells all along a multi-storied outside wall, all facing inward. In the center would be a round guard tower looking outward, from which the guards could closely observe any cell. The catch was this: the guards would be obscured from the prisoner's vision by window blinds or other methods, so that the prisoners wouldn't know when they were being watched. But they would know that they could be being watched at any time. Bentham argued that even though the prisoners knew that they couldn't be all watched all the time, each individual prisoner would always think they were being watched, or at least suspect it, and thus regulate their own behavior. In this way, you could ensure the good behavior of hundreds of prisoners with only one guard, or even none. This, Bentham argued, would also deter those who visited the prison from committing crimes, because they wouldn't want to live in such a condition. To my knowledge, no panopticon was ever built precisely to Bentham's specifications, but the basic idea still influences prison design to this day. In 1975, the panopticon was reintroduced to the public and academics by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, a history of prisons in which Foucault argues for a reform to the penal system that had grown out of Bentham's influence. It's part of a larger system, he argued, aimed not at reforming prisoners, but at the control of society, which it accomplishes by creating a delinquent class that police have to constantly monitor. The end result, Foucault argues, is that all of society is subjected to a panopticon-like state of continual monitoring. Foucault's work was heavily criticized. He seems to have neglected other motivations the powers of be could have for imprisoning criminals, but his worries about a panopticon-like society were actually anticipated by one of the most famous pieces of science fiction ever written, George Orwell's 1984, which has been reimagined cinematically many times. "1984 is set in a world in which a Stalinist totalitarian party has risen to power in the West. It follows the life of Winston Smith, a member of a middle-class group called the Outer Party, who works for what is called the Ministry of Truth. There, he rewrites history books to conform to the party's version of historical events, often erasing the existence of persons from history, thus making them unpersons. Despite his job, Winston hates the party, but he can never express his dissent aloud because the party has created the impression that everyone is always being watched. It's believed that telescreens, which are everywhere, including people's homes, are equipped with cameras and microphones. So Big Brother, the party's leader, could be watching and listening at any time. Indeed, people are routinely arrested for thought crimes, expressing any thought that is contrary to the party's ideology, even when they do so in private. The result is a terrified public, forever afraid to do anything but praise the party and Big Brother. Winston's fear of observation is so bad that even when he sits behind his telescreen and writes down his anti-party thoughts to himself in a journal, he's still convinced that he's been seen and that his arrest is just a matter of time. I won't spoil the ending, but I mention 1984 to show you the dangers of a panopticon-like existence. The first is that continual observation and the constant threat of punishment removes the possibility of virtuous behavior. For behavior to be truly virtuous, it must be done without compulsion, for its own sake. You should do the good because it is good, not because someone will punish you if you don't. This is a worry about Bentham's panopticon prison. It makes the rehabilitation of prisoners impossible because it removes the possibility of them learning to behave on their own. As soon as you release them back into society and remove the threat of observation, they'll just go back to their old ways. Something like this is the basis of Richard Dawkins's claim that only atheists can be ethical. The stereotype, of course, is that atheists are immoral people because they don't think there is a big man in the sky watching them to punish them if they do wrong. In one study, people thought that being an atheist made a person more likely to be a serial killer. Statistically, however, there is no evidence that this is true. Indeed, research shows that theists and atheists commit moral and immoral acts at the same rates. But, Dawkins argues, the moral actions of theists can't be truly virtuous. They can't do them for their own sake. Why? Because if you're a theist, you believe that you are constantly being observed by God, a being that will punish you for doing wrong. Only the atheist, who believes that no one is watching, who believes that there will be no consequences for doing wrong, can truly, virtuously choose the good for its own sake. The second major worry about a panopticon-like existence is the lack of privacy. Now, I've often heard it said that as long as you aren't doing anything wrong, you shouldn't worry about your privacy. I mean, what have you got to hide? But there are a number of reasons to desire privacy, even if you never do anything wrong. First of all, you can never be sure that those watching you have the right definition of what counts as right behavior. In 1984, Winston's not doing anything immoral by writing down his grievances with the party, yet he cannot do so without fear. Even if the moral things you want to do are legal today, they may not be tomorrow. Second, privacy seems to be a fundamental right. In the same way that you have a right to use your body as you see fit, it seems that you have a right to keep information about yourself private. It's your body, your life. Information about it should be available only to those you choose and only in the matter in which you choose. Even porn stars who make their naked bodies available to be seen by anyone online still have a right to not be spied on in their own home. Third, a functioning democracy requires privacy. Of course, there is a certain amount of privacy that we must give up, say, in public spaces, for a certain amount of security, but there are limits. Governments and corporations shouldn't be able to wiretap our communications. One must be free to keep their vote secret, or anonymously call out corruption and injustice so as to not fear political retaliation. Indeed, the more someone knows about your private life, the more power they have over you. Absolute knowledge would be absolute power. A free society should not let anyone, especially the government and corporations, have that kind of power. And fourth, the depth of our relationships is often defined by how much privacy we allow the other person to violate. Without privacy, relationships might not even be possible. What value is there in me sharing my secrets with my wife if everybody already knows them? In fact, even in the deepest of relationships, you still desire, in fact, need privacy. Honestly, I doubt any relationship could actually last any time at all if each person knew literally everything about the other. We just have too many dark little secrets. This fact was demonstrated quite nicely in the Black Mirror episode, The Entire History of You, which is set in a world in which everyone has recording devices called grains in their eyes that record and can play back everything that he or she sees. When Liam becomes suspicious of his wife's infidelity, his ability to prove it using information from his and her grain essentially ruins his life. You might think he'd be thankful to know the truth, but in the end of the episode, he cuts the grain out of his own eye. But as the episodes we have discussed reveal, it's not the government that is subjecting us to a panopticon-like existence. It's us. Through social media, we are the watching eyes, tracking everyone around us, rating, commenting, judging, condemning. We are the voluntary authors of our own demise. Of course, There is one important difference between the kind of panopticon surveillance and the government surveillance by Big Brother in 1984 and what we do on Facebook and Twitter. Consent. We don't have to use Facebook and Twitter. We don't have to share our lives on it. There are even privacy settings we can configure to our liking. People choose to use these services for the social benefits they provide. And privacy can certainly be rightly exchanged for benefits. For example, I'm a member of my local grocery store's membership program. I allow them to track my purchases in exchange for lower prices and discounts on gas. And this, it seems, is perfectly innocent. The worry, however, is this. There may be a point at which it is no longer voluntary. In Nosedive, social media use is not exactly dictated by the state. The truck driver, Susan, for example, no longer uses hers. But it is needed to gain the necessary ranking for many of society's amenities. Many people may not really have a choice. How much social pressure is put on us to use social media? It's where almost everything happens now. Party invites, group organizations, networking. The great courses even pushed me to get a Twitter account to promote my courses.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry, be quiet.
We're sorry.
Well, you should be. Studies have actually shown that use of social media can be addictive, literally releasing the same kind of chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin associated with gambling addiction. So really, how much choice do we have? But now, we're really talking about ethics, the study of what's moral and what's immoral. So next, we really need to be asking questions about what makes something right or wrong, good or evil. To do so, I want you to watch a movie in a franchise famous for pitting good against evil, Star Wars. Specifically, I want you to watch Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. As you do, ask yourself whether the rebels in the movie, who are supposed to be the good guys, are actually terrorists. Last lecture, our worries about the dangers of technology motivated an exploration of ethics, the branch of philosophy that attempts to define the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. To do so, I want to explore the franchise that most famously pits good against evil, Star Wars. The original Star Wars is one of the most iconic and successful science fiction films of all time. It tells the story of a young orphan named Luke Skywalker who teams up with the Jedi Obi-Wan Kenobi, a smuggler named Han Solo, and a princess named Leia Organa to fight against Darth Vader and the evil Empire, which has constructed a giant planet-destroying weapon called the Death Star. Together, they successfully deliver the stolen Death Star plans to the Rebel Alliance, which then discovers the Death Star's weakness and, with Luke's help, destroys the Death Star. The wild success of the original actually came as a surprise to its creator, George Lucas. And that success meant both good news and bad news. The good news? He can now make the sequels. The story he originally wrote was so long, he was only able to film the first act. He could now film the other two acts that he had put on the shelf. The bad news was that, to make the first act work as a movie, Lucas essentially spoiled the other two. For example, he had to move the big Death Star battle at the end of Act 3 to the end of Act 1 so that his first movie had an exciting ending. He had also originally intended to have a race of tall, hairy, non-technological primitive warriors called Wookiees assist the rebellion in their final battle to destroy the Death Star. Because he settled for making a single Wookiee named Chewbacca Han Solo's co-pilot, he could no longer do this. Chewbacca's piloting and mechanical skills clearly established that Wookiees were not non-technological primitives. His solution? Ditch originality. To end the third movie, he just had the Empire build another Death Star and then had the rebellion blow it up again. And to help them do it, he just cut his primitive Wookiee idea in half, reversed the name, Wook-E became E-Walk, and a furry little annoyance was born. The original Star Wars trilogy is also notorious for its lack of moral ambiguity, for being painfully black and white. Luke, dressed in white, and the Rebel Alliance are obviously good. Darth Vader, armored in black, and the Empire are obviously bad. Emperor Palpatine, Darth Vader's master, is cartoonish and almost comically evil. A grotesque, wrinkled figure hidden under a cloak who cackles as he reveals his plans. John Williams, who composed the film's music, even wrote every hero's theme in a major key and every villain's theme in a minor key to make sure we orient our emotions appropriately. Some might argue that Han Solo is a gray character. He's a scoundrel with a bounty on his head who will, without remorse or hesitation, kill any bounty hunter who comes after him and then just toss some money to the barkeep to make up for the mess. But even Han is redeemed by the end of the first film. He swoops in on the Millennium Falcon to save Luke from Darth Vader at the last second, giving Luke the chance he needs to blow up the Death Star. The first one. In the original trilogy, you never have to wonder who the good guys and the bad guys are. This is not as true of the prequel trilogy, episodes 1 through 3. It's set during a time in which the galaxy is governed by a democratic republic, and the Jedi Knights serve as a kind of military police, the supposed guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy. Palpatine secretly orchestrates an invasion of his own planet to gain sympathy votes for his election as Chancellor of the Republic. Once elected, he orchestrates a civil war and uses the threat it poses to acquire emergency powers, and then reorganizes the Republic into the First Galactic Empire. All the while, he follows Anakin Skywalker's Jedi training and gains his trust. And when the time is right, he convinces Anakin to turn against the Jedi. He reveals himself as the Sith Lord Darth Sidious and declares Anakin to be Darth Vader. Palpatine uses Anakin and the Empire's clone army to kill all the Jedi, and then he and Vader go on to rule the galaxy. One way the prequels are morally ambiguous is that Palpatine is a good guy at first, a senator from Naboo. If you hadn't seen the original trilogy, the reveal in episode 3 that he is the Emperor might actually come as a surprise. But where we see their moral ambiguity most clearly, and where we can explore the difference between good and evil, and even the question of whether there is a difference, is in how Palpatine turns Anakin to the dark side. Palpatine tries to turn Anakin by convincing him that the Jedi are evil, that they only want to hold on to their power, and that they don't trust democracy. And he might have a point. The Jedi are, after all, trying to overthrow Palpatine, who, despite all his scheming, was duly elected and granted the powers he has by a majority vote. Mace Windu even tries to deny Palpatine his day in court and attempts to assassinate him instead. This makes you wonder, could the Jedi actually be the bad guys? Now, if you've seen the movies, that might seem crazy, but I want you to think about this. Consider exactly what Palpatine has done to gain power up to the moment that the Jedi try to arrest him and Anakin sides with him. And I'm not talking about the Clone Wars cartoons, just what happens in the first 3 movies. In episode 1, he did stage an invasion of Naboo to gain sympathy. But it was an invasion by a droid army of a planet with no army. And recall, in Lucas's Star Wars universe, droids aren't even considered conscious. So no one was hurt. Granted, some Gungans died as they fought the droid army outside of Naboo's capital, but that battle was orchestrated by Queen Amidala, one of the good guys. In episode 2, Palpatine starts a civil war, but it's primarily fought between droids and clones. And it seems in Lucas's universe, clones are just as soulless as droids. Lucas doesn't like real people to be killed en masse in his movies because kids are watching. Of course, Palpatine did command Anakin to kill Count Dooku, but the Jedi actually wanted him dead. Palpatine, it seems, didn't directly cause that much actual suffering as he rose to power. Of course, Palpatine schemed with hostile foreign powers to get himself elected and used the cause of greater security to get the Senate to grant him emergency powers. But is that all that different from what American presidents have done? Now, I'm not in favor of such things, but the right solution is not to have army generals, our version of the Jedi, forcefully remove them from power or assassinate them. Law enforcement should expose their corruption, and the other branches of government should check their power, remove their emergency powers, impeach them, overrule them in court. My point is this: up to the moment at which Anakin makes his choice between Palpatine and the Jedi, it's not clear that Palpatine has done anything to legally deserve being removed from office. If you didn't already know what he would become and what he would do later, you might think that the Jedi were in the wrong for thinking that they are above the law. Or at the very least, you might be able to argue that the Jedi are no better than the Sith. After all, as Luke Skywalker points out in The Last Jedi, it was the hubris of the Jedi that allowed Palpatine to rise to power. It was Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi, who trained Darth Vader. Their history is fraught with failure. That's why Luke initially thinks it's time for the Jedi to end. The idea that the Jedi are no better than the Sith is essentially the conclusion that the Emperor is trying to get Anakin to draw. And to do so, he gives an argument that mirrors quite nicely the arguments of the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, which are found in his works like Thus Spake Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche suggested that our evaluations of good and evil are merely a result of what Obi-Wan might call our moral points of view, which in turn are merely a result of our culture and upbringing. Christian culture, for example, teaches charity, forgiveness, and sympathy. The Chinese value honor, Muslims submission to Allah. And in creating these moral codes, Nietzsche argued, they are all motivated by the will to power, what Nietzsche believed was the main driving force in humans for, roughly put, higher positions in life that grant one more control over others. But if we have only our perspectives on morality, then there are no moral facts. This nihilistic conclusion follows, Nietzsche argued in Zarathustra, from the realization that God is dead, perhaps his most famous utterance. Now, by this, Nietzsche did not mean that God had lived and died. He didn't even mean that God never existed, although Nietzsche was an atheist. What he meant, however, was that the idea of God was dead. It was no longer useful in daily or academic life. That's not to say that some didn't still believe. They did. Indeed, in The Gay Science, Nietzsche said that the news of God's death had not yet reached the ears of man. But because of the influence of science, philosophy, and biblical criticism, the idea of God was on its way out, Nietzsche thought, like disco music was on its way out in the late 70s, early 80s. This meant, among other things, that soon everyone would realize that the idea of God was no longer useful for explaining things like the difference between good and evil. But Nietzsche wasn't a nihilist, someone who thinks that there are no moral facts. Indeed, a lack of moral facts terrified him. He thought conceptions of right and wrong were necessary for society to function. But he also thought that the slave morality the church used to keep society in line was destroying it, causing it to regress. Borrowing from Hegel, Nietzsche saw history as a struggle between ideas. In The Genealogy of Morals, he sees the history of ethics as a struggle between what he called the master morality of the Greeks and Romans, found in the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey, which prize things like nobility and strength, courage, power, achievement, and individual freedom. And then the slave morality of Judeo-Christianity, preached by people like Jesus, which prize things like humility, weakness, and submission to others. What happened, Nietzsche argued, is that in reaction to being oppressed and enslaved, people like the ancient Jews convinced themselves that being oppressed was noble. Instead of recognizing that being oppressed was bad and seeking to overthrow their oppressor and take their place, the Jews vilified their oppressors and their power and made being powerless a moral good. For Nietzsche, this kind of slave morality taking hold in society was humanity's biggest setback. Only abandoning it for something like the Greek master morality could move the human race forward. If, one, Nietzsche is right, and two, that is what Palpatine is doing, trying to move beyond good and evil and embrace the master morality, then a case could be made that Palpatine actually is the hero. So now we must wonder, is that what the Emperor is doing? It sure seems like it. First, in the opera scene in episode 3, where Palpatine lays the groundwork for turning Anakin, he tells Anakin that our evaluations of good and evil are, just as Nietzsche said, a result of our point of view. He also suggests that the Jedi's treachery is motivated by their will to power, their fear of losing it. He even appeals to Anakin's own will to power to try to convert him, suggesting that the dark side is Anakin's only chance to prevent his wife Padme's death. Second, Palpatine seems to be rejecting a slave morality for a master morality. Consider the code of the Jedi. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. Jedi don't get angry or seek revenge. They avoid attachments like marriage and always submit to the will of the Force. They always have a selfless regard for others and can't even fear their own death. Sure sounds like a slave morality to me, but consider the code of the Sith Palpatine has embraced. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Strength, power, victory, freedom. That sure sounds like Nietzsche's master morality. And third, Nietzsche was critical of democracy because he thought it was rooted in the slave morality. It takes power away from dominant, powerful individuals and spreads it among everyone, making everyone a slave. And in episode 4, Palpatine actually dissolves the Senate, thus erasing democracy. So Palpatine, recognizing good and evil are mere points of view and motivated by his sheer will to power, rejects the slave morality of the Jedi. But he doesn't embrace nihilism. Instead, he embraces a new morality that he believes will better organize society. It certainly sounds Nietzschean. And perhaps Lucas intended it to be. Perhaps he even intended to vilify Nietzsche by making the Emperor a villain. If so, however, the critique falls short because the Emperor doesn't follow through in a Nietzschean way. His main failure has to do with a misapplication of his will to power. Although Nietzsche thought that it was the main driving force for human behavior, he did not think that the proper way to channel that force was by imposing your will on others. Indeed, Nietzsche thought that being kind to others and thus ingratiating yourself to them was a much better way to gain power. But ideally, according to Nietzsche, this drive would instead be directed into creative, life-affirming endeavors. This could include business ventures that benefit humanity, like that of Elon Musk or Bill Gates, people that the slave morality would abhor. But preferably, it would include efforts of self-mastery, what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. that allows you to overcome your base desires and impulses and become your true self. A self that, as Nietzsche says in Schopenhauer as Educator, does not lie buried deep within you, but rather rises immeasurably high above you. Clearly, this does not describe what the emperor is doing. So even if Nietzsche is right, the emperor is not the hero of the story. But still, that doesn't mean that the Jedi are. The moral ambiguity of the new Star Wars material that's been released since Disney bought the rights from George Lucas in 2012 is even more pronounced. Disney's first film, The Force Awakens, begins with what would have been impossible in the original series. A faceless stormtrooper has a crisis of conscience. Tired of the First Order reawakening of the Empire, forcing him to kill, he teams up with a resistance pilot and later an orphaned girl named Rey to escape. You might think this makes him a good guy, but he actually abandons his new friends for his own safety halfway through the film. He does eventually join up with the good guys, the resistance, but it's really only to rescue Rey after she is kidnapped. And it turns out she was able to rescue herself anyway. Now, most consider Rey a good guy, but by the end of the film, it's not so clear. When she defeats Kylo Ren, the film's masked bad guy, there's a moment when you think she might actually kill him in cold blood. Indeed, in the novelization of the film, Rey actually hears the voice of Ren's master, Supreme Leader Snoke, telling her to kill him. And she almost gives in. Only because the Earth splits between her and Kylo does she lose the opportunity. And in the film score, John Williams composed Rey's theme in a minor key, just like Darth Vader's theme and the Emperor's theme, making some suspect, at the time anyway, that eventually, like Anakin Skywalker, Rey might go bad. Even Kylo Ren, despite the fact that he dresses in black and wears a mask and has a menacing voice, is not necessarily evil. Although, spoiler alert, he kills his father Han Solo in the film, he is genuinely conflicted about it. His master says one thing, his conscience tells him another. He is constantly tempted by the light side of the Force. In fact, Kylo's not even a Sith, the order of the Force users to which the Emperor and Darth Vader belonged. He tries to balance both the light and dark sides of the Force within him. The moral ambiguity of the new Star Wars universe became crystal clear with the release of Rogue One, A Star Wars Story in 2016, which is why I ask you to watch that film before this lecture. It tells the story of how the Rebel Alliance stole the Death Star plans that Luke, Han, and Leia recover in Episode 4. The film is filled with morally ambiguous characters. An Imperial pilot, for example, defects, bringing a message to Saw Gerrera, an old ally of the rebels. Saw Gerrera himself, although he fights the Empire, engages in guerrilla tactics, many of which endanger innocent lives, like that little girl that Jyn Erso rescues during the street attack on Jeddah. He even tortures the pilot, bringing him the message to make sure that he's not lying about it. The message the pilot brings to Saw is from Galen Erso, the Imperial engineer who designed the Death Star, but who secretly designed a weakness into the station so that it could be destroyed by the rebels. Even the rebels in the film are not obvious good guys. Early in the film, one of them, Cassian, kills a fellow rebel informant, Tivik, so he won't be captured and to save his own life. The rebels try to align with Saw Gerrera despite his spotty history. They ambush a prison transport to free the heroine, Jyn Erso, but not even Jyn trusts them, and she tries to escape. And indeed, although they say they are going to try to rescue her father, Galen, they really intend to kill him. Toward the end of the film, Cassian even admits that he and his rebel friends have all done terrible things on behalf of the rebellion. They've been spies, saboteurs, assassins. All this might make one think that the rebels are essentially terrorists. They're fighting a fascist regime, sure, but they use terrorism to do it. Watching Rogue One makes one realize that the rebels might see their attack on the Death Star as Al-Qaeda saw its attack on the USS Cole in the year 2000. It was an attack on a military weapon used by the prevailing power to rain death and destruction on its enemies and solidify its control over the world. Indeed, the Rebel Alliance has something else in common with current Islamic terrorist organizations overseas, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and current Christian terrorist organizations in the US, like the KKK, the Army of God, and the Phineas priesthood. They're religious fanatics. The rebels, unlike those of the Empire, believe in the Force, a mystical energy that they believe gives them power and is on their side. They even greet each other and call on its power with a familiar phrase, "May the Force be with you." This is not at all unlike members of ISIS, who think that God has called them to establish a worldwide caliphate, or the KKK, who think that God has called them to establish the US as an all-white nation. I've even heard it said that the only difference between terrorists and freedom fighters is the difference between winners and losers. The winners write the history and call the losers terrorists. Could the only reason that we don't call the rebels terrorists be because we're told that they're the good guys? All in all, probably not. By definition, terrorists are those that intentionally target innocents for the purpose of instilling terror in the populace to coerce capitulation, usually from a government. That's why they're called terrorists. Of course, innocents can also be killed accidentally in war by soldiers trying to kill enemy combatants. Soldiers might even attack a military installation knowing that it will cost a certain number of innocent lives, but deem it an acceptable loss. But that doesn't make them terrorists. Both are regrettable, both might even be immoral. We'll talk about just war theory later. But neither are intentionally targeting innocents, so they are not terrorists. Now, don't get me wrong. Propaganda is still used by the winners of wars to label those who lost as terrorists, even when they're not. And the term is definitely thrown around in the media with a bias. White people who gunned down 58 innocents at a Las Vegas concert are just called lone gunmen. But Muslims who run over 8 with a rented truck are called terrorists. But we can't rightly call the rebels in Star Wars terrorists because, at least as far as I know, they don't ever intentionally target innocent civilians. But I also don't mean to suggest that government military operations can't engage in terrorism. In Star Wars Episode 4, Grand Moff Tarkin intentionally targets the civilians of Alderaan, destroying their entire planet with the Death Star to instill terror across the galaxy. So Tarkin is a terrorist. And when the US intentionally dropped atomic weapons on the civilian populations of the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki, by definition, that was an act of terrorism. Sure, it likely ended the war early, thus saving the lives of far more Japanese and American soldiers than it cost in civilian lives. Indeed, since my grandfather probably would have been called from the European theater to fight in the Pacific had the war gone on, I might not even be here had it not been for the US dropping those bombs. But it was still an intentional attack on civilian non-combatants to get the Japanese government to capitulate. So, by definition, it was a terrorist attack. But the fact that the rebels aren't terrorists doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are innocent, that they are the good guys. After all, they have performed military operations knowing that they would also take innocent lives. As Kevin Smith's movie Clerks points out, since the second Death Star was not complete when the Rebel Alliance attacked it, there were likely innocent contractors working on it when it exploded. And they likely weren't the business owners that contracted the job. That doesn't make it terrorism, but it does make it morally questionable. Ultimately, one wonders whether the Rebel Alliance's rebellion against the Empire is justified at all. Now, I'm not saying the Empire is good. As we've discussed, although the Jedi may not have been justified to try to forcefully remove the Emperor from power when they did, the Emperor ended up being unequivocally evil, and so is his empire. But that doesn't automatically make the rebels' rebellion against the empire justified. So what would make it justified? Well, the easiest answer would be to appeal to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral theory developed most famously by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They saw pain as the only intrinsic evil and pleasure or happiness as the only intrinsic good. This means that the morality of actions can be determined by how much pain or pleasure in the general populace they cause. As Mill put it, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce pain and the privation of pleasure. If an action causes more happiness overall for people than it causes pain, then it is morally good. If it caused more pain overall for more people than it caused happiness, then it is morally bad. If it's a wash, then the action is morally neutral. Utilitarianism is all about the greatest good, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It is its utilitarian benefit that one might argue justifies the Rebel Alliance's rebellion against the Empire. Sure, they wage war, they kill, they might even have had destroyed the second Death Star knowing that there were civilian contractors on it. But by defeating the Empire, they are saving far more innocent lives than they are taking, so their rebellion is the right thing to do. We actually see this logic at play during Star Wars Rogue One, when the generals of the rebellion decide to surrender to the Empire rather than attempt to steal the Death Star plans. When this happens, Jyn Erso decides to try to go get them herself. Cassian and a group of rebel fighters volunteer to go with her, and then he explains their decision like this. We've all done terrible things on behalf of the rebellion. Spies, saboteurs, assassins. Everything I did for the rebellion. And every time I walked away from something I wanted to forget, I told myself it was for a cause that I believed in, a cause that was worth it. Without that, we're lost. Everything we've done would have been for nothing. I couldn't face myself if I gave up now. None of us could. In other words, whether the terrible things he has done for the rebellion are ultimately morally good or morally bad, all depends on whether or not they ultimately lead to the greater good, whether they will have helped bring about an end to the Empire and free the galaxy from tyranny. If they give up now, the terrible things they have done will only have caused others pain. Only if those actions were necessary to bring about a much greater good can Cassian live with himself, for only then would his actions be moral. But there are essentially three things wrong with defending a rebellion against a government on utilitarian grounds. First, it seems that the justification of a rebellion shouldn't turn on whether it succeeds or not. If a government is so corrupt that it needs to be overthrown, then we need to try to overthrow it. A rebellion against it would be a noble cause, and it's still a noble cause, even if it fails. If the Rebel Alliance's rebellion is justified, then whether or not what Cassian did in its name is justified does not turn on whether the rebellion is successful. Second, the fact that something has utilitarian benefit doesn't automatically make it morally justified. You could potentially produce much more happiness than pain by enslaving 5% of the population to do all the dirty work of society for the other 95%. But that wouldn't make it right. Indeed, this is why terrorism is usually regarded as morally wrong regardless of circumstance. It's always wrong to target civilians, even if it would save more lives in the long run. The consequences don't matter. Of course, the Alliance hasn't done that, but this still means that the mere fact that its success saved more lives than it cost doesn't automatically mean that their rebellion is justified. The third objection is more complicated. It begins by asking what justifies a government in the first place. What morally binds us to obey the laws of a government we find ourselves living under? It would seem that knowing this would be crucial to understanding when it is permissible to disobey those laws, say, by rebelling against the government. Is the government supposed to provide a service? If so, what? And if it stops providing it, is rebellion then justified? It is to these questions that I want to turn next lecture. To do so, I want to talk about two different TV series. Blake 7, which you've likely never heard of, and Firefly, which you very well may have heard of. You might be able to find some Blake 7 episodes with a web search, but you should definitely be able to find Serenity, the movie that came out after the first and only season of Firefly. Go watch it, and as you do, ask yourself whether Mal is justified in his rebellion against the Alliance. Our previous discussion of the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars led us to questions about the nature of and justifications for political rebellion. When is it justified for one to rebel against the state, as, say, the American colonies did in 1776, and the French did in 1789, and the Russians did in 1917? What must a government do or fail to do to deserve to be toppled? And what are people justified to do to topple it? To tackle these questions, I ask you to watch Serenity, the sequel to the TV show Firefly. Set in the year 2517, the story is about a former rebellion soldier, Malcolm Reynolds, known as Mal, and his renegade crew of 7 aboard his Firefly-class spaceship, Serenity. It's set in a future in which two superpowers, China and America, rose to dominance on Earth and then combined to form a new world government called the Alliance. When environmental disaster rendered Earth uninhabitable, humanity spread to a new star system called 34 Tauri, a cluster of stars all orbiting a giant white sun, each with their own planetary systems, which all of this is called the Verse. The Alliance is headquartered in the central planets that orbit the white sun directly. The planets around the other stars are called border planets or are part of the outside rim. Although the monsters in the show are the Reavers, vicious, insane monsters that eat human flesh, the real villain is the Alliance, the government against which Mal rebelled. The Alliance tended to concentrate their resources and technology on the central planets, leaving the border planets to fend for themselves. When the border planets tried to make the separation official, however, the Alliance fought back, starting the Unification War. Think of it like the American Civil War, where the South tried to secede and the North fought to keep the Union together. Except Mal and the independent faction known as Browncoats weren't fighting to preserve slavery. They were fighting for independence from a government who had neglected them. In fact, the show's creator, Joss Whedon, was inspired by Michael Shara's historical fiction novel, The Killer Angels, and its stories about those who lost the Civil War. Like the Confederate bushwhackers Jesse James and his gang, who moved out west to avoid the rule of the government they hated, Mal and his crew moved deeper into space for the same reason. Although it seems unique, Firefly is actually similar to an old British sci-fi show that no one's ever heard of, one of my favorites, Blake's 7. Blake's 7 begins with the story of a man named Raj Blake, a political dissident fighting against an oppressive government called the Federation. He's arrested for subversive activities and sentenced to life on a penal colony. On the way there, with the help of some new criminal friends, he manages to escape aboard a ship called the Liberator, which turns out to be the fastest, most powerful ship in the galaxy. Over time, he allies with 7 others, get it, Blake's 7, and the show follows the adventures of Blake and his crew as they roam the galaxy fighting against the Federation. So both Firefly and Blake 7 are about a man, his ship, and his crew on the run, rebelling against an oppressive government that rules outer space with an iron fist. Even the crews are similar. There's the pilot, the warrior, the genius, the expert, the telepath, the anti-hero who's in it for the money. Although where Blake has a thief and a smartass computer named Aurak, Mal has a doctor and a smartass priest named Book. Both shows were willing to kill off main characters unexpectedly, and both shows were canceled too soon. Even their ships are very similar. Firefly is called Firefly because the ship Serenity looks like, well, it looks like a firefly with a big glowing butt for an engine. The Liberator has one too. The main difference between the two ships is just the number of protrusions that go out from its main body. Serenity has 2 and the Liberator has 3. Now, Whedon has specifically denied watching any British science fiction, including Blake 7. I don't know if I believe him. But then again, both shows may just have borrowed from John Ford's 1939 movie Stagecoach, which involves a marshal, a driver, and a crew of 7. But it doesn't really matter for our purposes, because what I want to concentrate on is the show's differences. Mainly, the different forms Blake and Mal's rebellions against the government take. Is one doing it better than the other? That's what I want to explore. And to answer that, we must ask whether Blake or Mal's rebellion is justified. And to answer that, we must consider when any rebellion against a government is justified. When should a government be overthrown? When does it become illegitimate? When is one no longer obligated to obey its laws? Anarchists argue that no government is ever justified, and thus no one is ever obligated to obey any of its laws. I articulated their arguments in the Big Questions of Philosophy, but such arguments can't be used to defend Mal or Blake's rebellion because they clearly aren't anarchists. This is especially true of Mal, who fought to align the border planets of the independent faction under one government. He doesn't reject all government, he just rejects ones like the Alliance. It doesn't seem that Blake is an anarchist either. Although he likes to cause havoc for the Federation, he also thinks his crew is obligated to obey him as long as they're voluntarily sticking around. In the early episode Time Squad, when Avon objects to Blake's plan of blowing up the Federation's transceiver complex on Saurian Major, Blake's response is simple. It was agreed that anybody could opt out at any time. Just tell me when you want to leave. This notion that Avon's continued presence on Blake's ship obligates him to obey Blake's orders is similar to the notion to which philosophers often appeal to explain how government is justified, why we are morally obligated to obey its laws. The government is justified, they argue, by the services and protections it provides. As long as it is providing them, and you are sticking around to enjoy them, then you are obligated to obey. Thomas Hobbes put it more precisely. Because we would rather not live in a state of complete liberty, of anarchy, what Hobbes called the state of nature, we implicitly agree to give up a measure of our liberty, our ability to govern ourselves, to a governing body as long as everyone else does the same. This agreement has come to be known as the social contract. According to Hobbes, we want to avoid the state of nature because it makes life solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It was so bad, Hobbes said, that rebellion against the government is never justified. No matter how badly the government mistreats you, the state of nature is worse, so just deal with it. This didn't resonate with everyone, however, and philosophers started thinking about the obligations of government and when they deserve to be overthrown. Which brings us to the philosopher John Locke. Locke thought Hobbes exaggerated the state of nature's brutality, but he did admit that it threatened one's life, liberty, and property. For Hobbes, you had no natural right to such things, so you had to just take what you could get. But Locke disagreed, saying that we have a right to such things even in the state of nature, and that it's to protect such natural rights that we all enter into the social contract. Thus, simply put, when a government fails to protect our natural rights to life, liberty, and property, rebellion against that government is justified. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. First, by entering the social contract, you necessarily give up a portion of your rights. For example, to ensure social stability, you agree to obey the laws. So by definition, a government will always be violating your liberty to some degree. So the question is really this: how do you distinguish between legitimate limits on your liberty and rights and grounds for rebellions? Well, Locke argued, since you enter the social contract with the government to protect your rights, you implicitly agree to do whatever is necessary to enable the government to protect your rights. So the government needs money to function. The government must defend the country from invasion. So even though taxation would take your property and drafting you into military service would hinder your freedom and endanger your life, rebellion wouldn't necessarily be justified in those cases. So the question now is, how do you determine what is necessary? How much of your money does the government need? When is the threat of invasion legitimate enough to warrant a draft? Locke's answer? The people decide. Although, even that's putting it a bit too simply. Actually, the government decides and the people decide on who's in the government. But Locke, even that's not exactly accurate. Locke was fine with voting rights being restricted to landed white non-Catholic gentry, and was even okay with the government containing non-elected members. So it's not like the majority elected their representatives. Indeed, the fact that Locke objected to government without consent, but also restricted voting rights to such a small group of people, is one of the most glaring contradictions in Locke's political philosophy. The same is true for the American founders who, inspired by Locke, held similar ideas. The second clarification that needs to be made is that Locke didn't think political rebellion was justified by just any violation of natural rights, like an unlawful arrest or taxes being too high. It has to be systematic violations where the very reason for the government's existence is negated. To give you an idea of what he means, other instances in which Locke thought a government could rightly be replaced were examples like if society is destroyed by a foreign invasion, or if the executive hinders, corrupts, or abolishes the legislature, governs arbitrarily without the consent of law, refuses to enforce the laws, refuses to submit to the rule of law, turns over rule to a foreign power, or dissolves the court. With this in mind, we can determine whether, according to Locke, Mal and Blake's rebellions are justified. Mal's is justified because the alliance seems to have been taxing and taking resources from the border planets and using them for the central worlds without offering any representation, protection, or services to the border planets in return. This grossly violates their rights to life, liberty, and property, so according to Locke, Mal's fight against the alliance as a brown coat with the independent faction was justified. This is especially true given the mind control that we discovered the alliance was trying to subject people to in Serenity. Blake's rebellion against the Federation is justified as well. They have erased his memory, killed his family, and sent him to a penal colony on trumped-up charges. The government is clearly not holding up its end of the social contract, so Blake is not obligated to obey its laws either. And Servalan, the evil Lord President that presides over the Federation in Blake 7, she does almost everything that Locke says an executive shouldn't do. She thinks she's above the law, she enforces it arbitrarily, she hinders the legislature. Clearly, the Federation deserves to be toppled. Notice this also helps us understand why rebellion of the Southern states during the American Civil War was not justified. The Southern states were not denied representation in the government, and the government was not failing to protect their life, liberty, or property. They were upset about the election of Abraham Lincoln, of course, but he was duly elected. He did not ignore the law. He did try to change the law regarding slavery, but he didn't even do that until after the Civil War was over, and when he did it, it was within the confines of the law. Now, as the Civil War teaches us, not every rebellion is successful. This is true for Mal and Blake as well. I won't spoil the ending of Blake 7 for you, but Firefly is set after the Browncoats' rebellion failed. Mal and his crew are simply seeking their freedom, despite the Browncoats' failure. Like Jesse James. Indeed, like Jesse James, Mal even robs a train. But what exactly does freedom amount to? What exactly are Mal and Blake seeking? In Two Concepts of Liberty, philosopher Isaiah Berlin argues that there are actually two kinds of liberty or freedom that we need to distinguish: negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is the kind of freedom we enjoy when we are free from outside interference or coercion. We are free to do X in this sense if no one else is threatening us not to do it. If there is a law against doing X, for example, then one is not free in the negative sense to do X. We might call this freedom from interference. Positive freedom is the freedom of self-determination or self-mastery. Someone who is a thinking, willing, active being who bears responsibility for their own choices and can explain them by references to their own higher ideas and purposes is positively free. As an example of someone who is not free in this sense, Berlin points to drug addicts who want to quit but are ruled by their lower irrational desires. They are not masters of themselves. They are slaves to the drug. They are not doing what their true self wants. Another useful distinction is this. It's one thing for someone to be a master of himself and choose a certain action. It's another for that action to not be against the law. But it's an entirely different thing to have the means or ability to do that action. My true self might want to buy the rights to Star Wars from Disney, and it might not be against the law for me to do so. But I don't have the means to do it. So in a sense, I do not have the freedom to do so. We might call this kind of freedom, freedom of means. These three kinds of freedom are often conflated and have not always been recognized or even sought after. Although in a political context, we usually think of freedom as freedom from interference from the law, this is actually a pretty new concept in the West. If you think about it, without freedom of means, the resources and abilities to do particular actions, laws permitting you to do those actions don't do you a whole hell of a lot of good. And for the majority of human history, most people haven't had the means to do much. A select few rich did, and the rest of us were lucky to feed our family and survive. It wasn't until capitalism gave rise to a middle class that freedom from interference really became sought after. This is why non-sci-fi movies, like Braveheart, are a bit anachronistic. William Wallace wouldn't have been concerned with freedom from interference, as he seems to be in the movie. The Scots wanted independence, sure, but because they wanted it to guard against abuses of power, like English soldiers raping brides, not because they had the means to do things that the laws of England were preventing them from doing. Wallace probably would have yelled independence, not freedom. So, what kind of freedom do Mal and Blake want? Well, probably a bit of freedom of means. Their respective governments seems to have robbed them of the ability to maintain the lifestyle they want, either by taxation, robbery of resources, or threat of death. But primarily, Mal and Blake are seeking freedom from interference. The laws of their government keep them from doing what they otherwise would be able to do. This is especially true of Mal, who, unlike Blake, isn't all that interested in fighting the alliance anymore. He just wants to be left alone to live his life. Both Mal and Blake are also seeking self-mastery, or at least have reason to fear that it could be taken away from them by the government. In the first episode of Blake 7, we learn that Blake had been captured by the Federation and had his memory erased. And then he was brainwashed into apologizing for his rebellion, and then into a model Federation citizen. If you've been brainwashed, you're not a thinking, willing, active being responsible for your own choices. In Serenity, we learn that Mal, too, has this to fear, given that the government has done something similar to River, the telepath in Mal's crew who's always on the verge of flying off the handle. What makes River such a sympathetic character is that she's not a master of herself. We rejoice at the end of Serenity when she finally is. We might think that interference with self-mastery is something the government could only do in science fiction through memory erasure and brainwashing, but it actually happens all the time through propaganda and ad campaigns and the manipulation of the media. And it's not just the government. Corporations, businesses, political organizations are all trying to get you to desire what they want you to desire, to value what they value, and to think what they want you to think. This is why the liberal arts, which emphasize literacy and critical thinking, are often called the arts of freedom. Liberal here means liberty or freedom in the sense of self-mastery. Liberal arts colleges, like my employer, King's College, aim to teach people how to think for themselves, to be masters of themselves, and not let others do their thinking for them. It's not just about getting you a job, it's about making you a better person. Perhaps ironically, while you do want the government to protect your freedom of means and self-mastery, you don't want it to guarantee them. Berlin argues that attempts by governments to guarantee self-mastery have led to nationalism, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism. The government decides what is actually in your best interest, what your true self would want, and then forces you to conform to that mold by ridding you of lower order desires that it thinks you shouldn't want. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that the desires of one's true self would always line up with the common good, what he calls the general will. If your desires are contrary to that, he argues, they should be corrected. You should be forced to be free, forced to master your lower order desires so as to align yourself with the common good. But imagine if the government started mandating alcoholics go to rehab, or tracked people's porn watching habits because they might not align with the common good. What if it banned certain works of art because it thought it would make people desire bad things? Ironically, protecting the freedom of self-mastery often involves incursions into freedom from interference. This is perhaps why the aftermath of the French Revolution, which Rousseau helped inspire, was so horrific. During what came to be known as the Reign of Terror, the Committee of Public Safety expelled religious figures, and up to 40,000 citizens were executed by revolutionary tribunals, arguably because their behavior didn't align with what was perceived to be the common good. You also don't want the government guaranteeing freedom of means. Although you want it to protect you from theft, you don't want the government to guarantee that everyone has the same means to do any action they desire. First of all, how would that even be possible? How can the government guarantee that I have the same means to win an Olympic medal as Michael Phelps? Secondly, guaranteeing that everyone has the same means would require guaranteeing that everyone has the same amount of money. And while that would be a desirable and fair state of affairs, attempts to do so in the past have turned out notoriously bad. Think of the worst failures of communism, where everyone was technically equal, except those in the government, but everyone was also much worse off. That's not to say that guaranteeing certain basic means like food, shelter, and education is bad. We already do that to a degree, and I've seen some decent arguments for guaranteeing a universal basic income. But guaranteeing everyone the means to do anything they want would be especially problematic. Of course, we do want the government to protect our negative freedom. We want to be free from interference, but this must have its limits as well. After all, a government that restricts nothing is equivalent to no government at all. When we enter into the social contract, we do so knowing that we are giving up some liberties because doing so is necessary to protect others. But which liberties should the government restrict? And which ones should it protect? The question of government restrictions and protections was addressed most famously by philosopher John Stuart Mill in his 1859 work, On Liberty. Mill pointed out that while the consent of the majority was certainly important, the majority can be just as tyrannical as a monarch. They can, for example, choose to enslave a minority population like the American South had done at the time. This he called the threat of the tyranny of the majority. To guard against it, a government should adhere to what came to be known as Mill's harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. In other words, you should be free in the negative sense to do anything you want as long as it doesn't include harming others. With this rule, Mill was actually guarding against intrusive protections of positive freedom, against the community dictating to individuals prescriptions on how best to live. He was especially frustrated by religious groups trying to force by law their taboos and moral norms onto others. Following his harm principle, Mill argued, was not only the best way to ensure the most happiness for the most people, by letting people decide for themselves how to live. This was also the best way to ensure the flourishing of the entire human species. Mankind are greater gainers, he said, by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. Of course, there are costs. Freedom isn't free, as the saying goes, but that doesn't just mean that soldiers have to fight to guarantee our freedom. They do, but it also means that guaranteeing freedom in society comes with risks. It means guaranteeing freedom of religion, even though some religions produce dangerous fanatics. Guaranteeing the right to bear arms, even though it makes mass shootings inevitable. Guaranteeing freedom of movement, even if it makes terrorist attacks easier. It means allowing people the freedom of speech, even to spread hate and bigotry. The harmful actions themselves are illegal, of course, but the only way to guarantee they never happen is to completely restrict liberty. Perhaps the best example is security checks at airports. They are an intrusion on liberty, and privacy, and even dignity for that matter. We could do away with them, but in doing so, we would make it easier for terrorists to access planes. That would be the cost of that freedom. Whether the cost of freedom is worth it must be gauged on a case-by-case basis. Maybe the freedom of movement at an airport isn't worth the increased risk of terrorist attacks. Maybe the freedom to bear arms isn't worth the risk of near daily mass shootings. Maybe the freedom guaranteed to businesses by free market capitalism isn't worth the resulting damage to the environment. If freedom isn't free, we have to consider the price tag. But fighting for freedom brings us back around to considering the methods by which Mal and Blake rebel against their respective governments. As similar as the shows are, their approaches to rebellion are quite different. Blake's approach is violent. He's blowing up installations and attacking military ships. He never targets the innocent, so he's not a terrorist, but he's certainly willing to tolerate some collateral damage. Mal, on the other hand, although he did violently rebel during the war, has adopted a peaceful form of protest. He just wants to be left alone. Eventually, he does attack the alliance, but is completely nonviolent. He spreads information. And this is why I wanted you to watch Serenity. In Serenity, Mal and his crew discover a secret that the Alliance doesn't want anyone to know. While surveying an outer planet named Miranda, in a clear violation of people's freedom of self-mastery, the Alliance tested an experimental chemical aimed at suppressing aggression, presumably to make people easier to control and govern. The effect on most was so severe that they died from becoming too docile to even eat or drink. The effect on a few was reversed. They became overly aggressive and violent and turned into the Reavers, a crazed race of maniacs that roam the verse, killing without remorse. Mal's act of rebellion is to transmit the confession of an Alliance scientist, the last survivor of Miranda, to every citizen in and outside of the Alliance, so they can know the horrendous crime of which the Alliance is guilty. This weakens the Alliance government considerably, and change may even be on the horizon at the end of Serenity. In a way, Mal is fighting against a corrupt government in the same way that a reporter might, not with violence, but with information. Which approach is better? Well, I suppose it all depends on the severity of the problem, the effectiveness of the method, and the probability of success. After all, the violence of Blake's rebellion was limited until he came to command the Liberator. Then he had the means and methods to effect a successful assault. Mal, his crew, and his little Firefly, on the other hand, couldn't hurt the Alliance with a violent attack with all the luck in the world. Yet, the information they spread was even more effective than Blake's efforts of rebellion against the Federation. Now, how does this all apply to the real world? Well, spreading information about the British government wasn't going to win the American colonies their independence. It played a role, but violence was necessary. On the other hand, today, a violent coup against the American government and its military would last about 30 seconds. We spend more on our military than the next 8 nations combined. That level of dissatisfaction with the government must almost necessarily take a non-violent form. Fortunately, our founding fathers may have actually laid the groundwork for this kind of rebellion. Thomas Jefferson, like Rousseau, thought that government was not something that you could just get right and then leave alone. Like fruit, government goes rotten and must be replaced. Revolutions to overthrow the government and return power to the people are needed pretty often, perhaps every generation. And this, he argued, is what elections are all about. Indeed, Jefferson's election was called the Revolution of 1800. But all this talk of rebellion and the difference between violent and peaceful resistance makes one wonder about the justification of war. After all, in the same way that you can try to solve domestic problems, either violently or non-violently, countries can do the same with international problems. And it seems that they too often choose war over diplomacy. But, one wonders, when exactly is war justified? Is it ever? After all, it inevitably kills millions, including civilians. Even if it's not intentional, isn't that wrong? Before we explore this question next lecture, I want you to watch the 1997 movie Starship Troopers. Now, this might seem like an odd choice. On its surface, Starship Troopers is just a gory shoot-'em-up with gratuitous nudity and wooden acting. But I need you to trust me on this. And as you watch, consider whether this movie is intended to be taken seriously. Are the heroes really heroes? Note the similarities with the real world too. What do they say about the movie's meaning? And what's with that football game at the beginning? And of course, ask yourself, would you like to know more? Our discussion of political rebellion last lecture led us to questions about war. Most importantly, the question, under what conditions, if any, is war justified? To explore this question, I want to talk about three views on the issue. Militarism, which suggests that war is very easily justified. Pacifism, which suggests that war is never justified. And just war theory, which suggests that war can be justified, but only in certain restricted conditions. To do so, we're going to talk about Starship Troopers, the Doctor from Doctor Who, and Ender's Game, the movie based on the book by Orson Scott Card. And I'd like to start by explaining why I asked you to watch Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers is a futuristic movie in which an alien insectoid species known as arachnids attacks Earth by throwing asteroids at it. Their first attack destroys Buenos Aires, the hometown of the protagonist, Johnny Rico. In response, he joins the military, along with his friends Carl, Carmen, and Dizzy, to get revenge. After an initially disastrously unsuccessful invasion of the bug's home planet Klandathu, and then some sexy time between Johnny and Dizzy, Johnny aids in the capture of a brain bug, which is directing the arachnids' military operations. The film ends with a military recruitment video that stars Johnny and his friends. On its surface, Starship Troopers is a shallow, poorly acted sci-fi shoot-'em-up about sexy teenagers blowing up space bugs and getting it on. Indeed, that's how it was received by most critics in 1997. That's certainly how I received it. I even remember exactly where I sat in the theater. So, why did I ask you to watch it? Because a little reflection led me to realize that there was a lot more going on. First, I considered how war was treated in the film. Not only is it romanticized in the news clips, but the soldiers treat it as sport. Dizzy throws grenades like she throws footballs and even celebrates with a touchdown dance when she successfully throws one down a giant bug's throat. Johnny says he learned the skills he used to kill a big bug on Planet P playing football. After capturing the brain bug, Sergeant Zen is lifted up on everyone's shoulders, just like Johnny was when he won the big game at the film's beginning. The military even calls the intelligence arm of their operation games and theory. Is this film criticizing the glorification of war, I ask myself, saying that we treat it like a sport? Then I remembered what was said about military violence. Johnny's history teacher decries democracy, saying it brought our world to the brink of chaos, and then glorifies the story of how the military took over and established martial law and a reigning stability. Violence is the supreme authority from which all other authority is derived, he says. Naked force has resolved more issues throughout history than any other factor. The contrary opinion, that violence never solves anything, is wishful thinking at its worst. Yet it's that very attitude that fuels the Terran Federation's doomed invasion of the arachnids' home planet. They go in with no strategy, no objective, and no direction other than, you smash the entire area, you kill anything that has more than two legs. Not even an exterminator has such a lack of strategy when trying to fumigate a house. As a result of this militaristic attitude, almost all of the humans are killed. So it's not glorifying militarism, I realized. Militarism being the view that a nation should maintain a large military and use it liberally and aggressively to promote the nation's interests both at home and abroad. It's criticizing it. Then I thought about how the film society is arranged. You can't vote unless you're a citizen, and only military service can earn you citizenship. You can't go into politics, pay for school, or even have a baby unless you've served. And non-citizens who dissent are punished in public by receiving lashes. Wait a minute, I said. Is this movie about fascism? So I looked up fascism. After all, people often throw that word around without really understanding what it means. Fascism, I learned, is an authoritarian political philosophy that suggests a nation functions best when all of its citizens are forced to align with a single political party that requires unquestioning loyalty to the state, its military, and its authoritarian dictator. Historically, fascists fiercely suppress opposing parties and ideas and brainwash their populace with pro-state, pro-party propaganda. This involves suppressing, vilifying, and even eventually eliminating a free press in order to establish a state-run press that will toe the party line, and that usually involves continually exaggerating and outright lying to its citizens, especially about foreigners, racial minorities, and those who oppose the party, and about the government's own actions. Fascist governments control the entire nation's industry and commerce in the name of economic stability and self-reliance, and discourage economic interaction with foreign powers, thus endorsing a mercantilism that suggests that you should only buy or sell things made within your own country. Under fascism, all citizens must serve the military, either directly or indirectly, as the military is seen as the only way to ensure security, not only from outside invasion, but also from dissenters from within the ranks. Police are militarized in the name of law and order. Correspondingly, fascism rejects the notion that violence is morally problematic. Instead, it sees war and imperialism, annexing other territories, as a way of strengthening the nation. Yep, I realized this is a movie about fascists. And then it dawned on me. The Federation's flags and symbols, the uniforms, the black boots and the pointy hats, even the architecture, everything looks like it came out of 1930s Germany. And those military recruitment clips and the news stories, the opening shot comes right out of Triumph of the Will, a 1935 propaganda film ordered by Hitler himself. This film is about Nazis. The Federation even treats the bugs like Nazis treated the Jews. It tries to exterminate them, uses them for medical experimentation, and refuses to even entertain the possibility that they're sentient. But it's not praising Nazis. All the main characters are deplorable. Dizzy is at peace with dying from her injuries merely because she got to sleep with Johnny one time. Carl turns into a cold-hearted strategist more than willing to sacrifice his own friends for strategic advantage. The only progress Johnny makes as a character is coming to see himself as a grunt whose only use is to die for the Terran Federation. These people are idiots. There isn't a single moral exemplar in the film. A little research revealed that the Robert Heinlein novel, which inspired the film, was actually overtly pro-fascist. But it was screenwriter Edward Neumeier and director Paul Verhoeven's express stated intention to turn the meaning of the original on its head. If I tell the world that a right-wing fascist way of doing things doesn't work, Verhoeven said, no one will listen to me. So I'm going to make a perfect fascist world. Everyone is beautiful, everything is shiny, everything has big guns and fancy ships, but it's only good for killing effing bugs. Verhoeven had grown up in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands and had become disturbed by some of the fascist tendencies he had started to see in places like Texas in 1990s America. You might think the idea of fascism in America is ridiculous, but consider the fact that America First was the name of a pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler, anti-Semitic committee that tried to keep Americans from fighting Hitler in World War II. It included a future president, Gerald Ford, a future Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, and had enough support to keep its doors open until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, hopefully, I don't have to spend too much time explaining why fascism is bad. Dictatorships are dangerous, as is governments deceiving and brainwashing their populace. A free press is necessary for the exchange of ideas and the exposure of government corruption. Economic isolation decimates the economy. Vilifying racial minorities is horrific. Militaristic police imposing law and order quickly leads to grand restrictions of personal liberties and makes possible horrors like the Holocaust. But militarism is embraced by more than fascists. Indeed, the fact that in 1997, critics missed the satire and thought Starship Troopers was celebrating militarism may have vindicated Verhoeven's worries. When criticism comes in the form of satire, those being criticized often can't detect the sarcasm. Nazis would have thought that Starship Troopers was a movie about the beautiful future of the Third Reich. Perhaps Americans were unable to realize that we were being mocked because Starship Troopers' pro-militarism hit a little too close to home. To explore the arguments against militarism, I want to consider the view on the opposite end of the philosophic spectrum: pacifism, the notion that military intervention and indeed violence of any kind should always be avoided. And I'd like to do so by exploring the pacifism of perhaps the most famous pacifist in science fiction, the Doctor. A Time Lord from Gallifrey who regenerates when he dies, thus turning into a new kind of person, played by a new actor, the Doctor travels through time and space in his TARDIS, helping those in need. One thing that remains constant regeneration to regeneration is that the Doctor never carries or uses a gun. A practical and symbolic gesture which demonstrates his commitment to non-violence. That's why he's called the Doctor. He doesn't kill his enemy, he outsmarts them, almost always giving them a chance to renounce their violent ways first. If they do die, it's almost always because they end up killing themselves. The Doctor figures out a way to turn their own violence against them. He does this quite literally in The Time of the Doctor. The Doctor tells a wooden Cyberman he's used his sonic screwdriver to reverse the polarity of the Cyberman's flamethrower so it'll fire out the back end. The Cyberman confirms the screwdriver signal, turns the flamethrower around, and fires, only to have the flamethrower fire into his chest, killing him instead. The Doctor neglected to mention that his sonic screwdriver doesn't work on wood. The Doctor's pacifism was the entire focus of the 50th anniversary special, The Day of the Doctor. A previously unknown regeneration of the Doctor, played by John Hurt, who had renounced pacifism to fight in the Time War, is faced with a choice. He can destroy his archenemy, the genocidal Daleks, preventing them from killing all life in the universe, but only by using a doomsday weapon called the Moment, which will also destroy his home planet of Gallifrey. Killing millions would seem to be better than neglecting to save trillions, the entire universe, yet because he's still a pacifist at heart, the Doctor hesitates. The episode serves as a pacifism manifesto because of how the plot resolves. Two of the Doctor's subsequent regenerations appear and help him realize there's a third choice. With the help of all their other regenerations, they can pull Gallifrey into an alternate dimension. This will not only save Gallifrey, but turn the Daleks' violence against them. Since the Daleks are all attacking Gallifrey from every angle, Gallifrey's disappearance will cause the Dalek ships to all be destroyed in their own crossfire. From this, we can derive the two main arguments that motivate pacifism. One is based in duty. Because humans, and Time Lords, have a right to life, killing and violence are always wrong, regardless of the consequences. Even if using the Moment would save more lives than it costs, it would still be wrong to kill. Two wrongs don't make a right. This is called deontological pacifism. And it's grounded by philosophers like Soren Rieder in Immanuel Kant's second categorical imperative. One should not treat others merely as a means to an end. even if that end is saving lives. The other argument is based in consequences. The idea is that, as solutions, acts of violence always do more harm than non-violent solutions. The choice, the pacifist argues, is not between violence and doing nothing. Doing nothing really could be worse. The choice is between action that is violent and action that is non-violent. And even when it seems that the only two options are killing some now or letting more die later, there is always another equally effective solution that does not require violence. Our presumption that violence can be justified prevents us from seeking it out. From this, we can derive pacifism's critique of militarism. Militarism jumps to using violence as a solution far too quickly, without a full appreciation of its costs or even considering the possibility of nonviolent action. And even if you are not a pacifist, this seems to be right. It's not good to rush to war too quickly. Now, when it comes to absolute pacifism, one can condemn individual acts of violence, such as killing, or larger social acts, such as war, or both. Absolute pacifism can be difficult to defend on the individual level, however, because most regard defending the innocent, including oneself, to be morally justifiable. If everyone has a right to life, failing to protect someone's life when you can seems to disrespect their right to life just as much as if you had killed them yourself. Someone who refused to rescue a drowning baby, for example, from a water fountain when they easily could, is morally guilty, just like the person who put the baby in there. In the same way, if someone is trying to kill another person but you could stop them, then you should, even if it means killing the attacker. Indeed, this is often the only available solution to such heat-of-the-moment situations. Being an absolute pacifist about war, however, is easier to defend. For one, regardless of whether war is intentional, it always involves killing innocents. And the deontological argument that killing innocents is always wrong has a lot of intuitive force. What's more, even combatants can be considered innocent. They're usually forced to fight by their governments. Soldiers would usually rather be home with their families. In addition, war causes a lot of harm, both immediately in the form of death and destruction, and in the long term in the form of political instability. Indeed, Ian Bickerton has argued that every war of the last 200 years has done more harm than good. Victory did not achieve its desired results, and war sacrifices were largely in vain. Take the Second Iraq War, for example. Although Saddam was cruel, removing him from power caused more instability and led to far more suffering than Saddam would have, and actually made terrorism worse. We would have been better off leveling economic and political sanctions against Saddam and taking covert actions such as intelligence operations to prevent terrorist attacks. But still, it's difficult to say that war can never be justified. Deontologically, can't a country rightly defend itself or innocence by waging war on an invader in the same way that I can rightly defend myself or an innocent by killing an attacker? If the right to life is absolute, refusing to defend it when you can seems immoral. And that includes when countries can wage war to save innocent lives. To paraphrase Jan Narveson, pacifism is hypocritical. If life is an absolute good, as the pacifist suggests, it must be worth defending. Derek Jensen takes this criticism a step further by suggesting that voluntary pacifism is something possible only for those who are not oppressed. Nonviolence is forced on the weak by the strong because the weak don't have the ability to fight back. By voluntarily advocating for pacifism, the pacifist further oppresses the weak by enabling the strong to oppress them. From a consequentialist point of view, it also seems possible for war to be justified. Take World War II, for example. Obviously, we don't think the Nazis' war for racial purity and world domination was justified, but most agree the Allies' war to stop them was. Yes, it led to the Cold War, the Korean War, and Vietnam, all of which were horrific. But that all seems like small potatoes when you think about the consequences of allowing Hitler to conquer Europe and quite possibly the world. Not only would he have succeeded in exterminating the Jews, but likely every minority group in the world, unless he decided to enslave them instead. And as demonstrated by the Amazon series, The Man in the High Castle, set in a world in which the Allies lost World War II, had Hitler won, the violations of human rights would have been disastrous. Of course, the pacifists would argue that there was a non-violent solution to Hitler's quest for world domination that we simply weren't considering, or perhaps Hitler's victory wouldn't have been as bad as the consequences of the war itself. But such arguments are as speculative as they are unconvincing. Hitler was a fascist, devoted religiously to violence with the means to conquer the world. As President Obama said in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, a non-violent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Thinking otherwise seems to be monumentally naive. Another criticism of pacifism is that it's hypocritical, because the only way that you can have the freedom to be a conscientious objector is by others fighting to guarantee that freedom. One of the Doctor's oldest foes, Davros, the creator of the Daleks, lobs such an objection at the Doctor in Journey's End. In the episode, Davros has kidnapped the Doctor. To ensure the Doctor's release, his companions, the humans the Doctor's traveled with over the years, unite to rescue him by threatening to use a weapon of mass destruction called a warp star. Davros then makes a keen observation. The man who abhors violence, never carrying a gun. But this is the truth, Doctor. You take ordinary people and you fashion them into weapons. Behold your children of time transformed into murderers. I made the Daleks, Doctor. You made this. How many have died in your name? The Doctor, the man who keeps running, never looking back because he dare not out of shame. This is my final victory, Doctor. I have shown you yourself. Davros's point is spot on. The Doctor doesn't carry a gun, but he aligns with those who do. And he wouldn't be able to accomplish what he does without them. The Doctor can only practice pacifism because others do the necessary dirty work of violence for him. In the same way, it seems that real-world pacifists could never practice pacifism had it not been for past wars fought to guarantee them that right. That's not to say that a personal commitment to pacifism can't be noble, but as an absolute, the notion that violence and war are never justified seems indefensible. But we've only considered the obvious intuitive examples of justified war, like World War II. What about other wars? And how could we tell whether some future war is justified? To answer that, we must consider just war theory, the middle ground between militarism and pacifism. Rooted in the writings of St. Augustine, who was trying to reconcile war with Jesus' pacifism, and later expanded by Thomas Aquinas, the conditions under which war is justified are generally divided into two categories by Latin phrases: jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum, what we might call the laws to war, dictates the conditions under which going to war is justified. War must be declared by a legitimate authority, say a leader elected by the population going to war. The war must also be for a just cause. Personal jealousy, pride, or lust for power won't cut it. Neither would revenge. The methods must be proportional. The harm you inflict by waging war can't be worse than what you were trying to prevent. In fact, you must aim to do the minimal amount of harm necessary. And you must have the intention to achieve a just cause, be reasonably sure of victory, and you must only engage in war as a last resort. Jus in bello, or what we might call the laws of war, dictate how war must be conducted if it is to be justified. Military actions must be rightly intended for legitimate military targets or objectives, and must also be proportional. They can't do more harm than good and must do the minimum harm necessary to accomplish the objective. They must both be necessary and sufficient for that objective. You shouldn't be able to accomplish the same goal in a nonviolent way, and what you do must be enough to accomplish it. They must also be approved by a legitimate authority. And finally, they must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. They cannot intentionally target civilians. Now, it's important to note that these are essentially guidelines. What counts as a just cause, for example, is debatable. And whether a war is just or not is not an all or nothing affair. It's a matter of degree. A violation of one of the principles, like the existence of a rogue officer like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, doesn't necessarily make the war completely unjustified. What's more, if one soldier sees another using disproportionate means, he can and should object, but he is not morally obligated to throw down his weapons and walk home because the entire war is now unjust. To make sure we understand how to apply the criteria, let's apply them to some sci-fi wars. First, the war against the arachnids in Starship Troopers. Interestingly, just war theory is actually alluded to in the film. As the humans are about to go to war with the bugs, a reporter says, "Some say the bugs were provoked by human attempts to colonize within the arachnid quarantine zone, that a live and let live policy is preferable to war with the bugs." But he is immediately shouted down by Johnny. "Yeah, well, I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say, kill them all!" In light of this, it seems their war is unjustified. Yes, the bugs attack them, but the humans colonize their territory. Peace could have been brokered by a treaty or pulling the colonists out. The humans also entered the war without good reason to think that they could actually win. That's why they got slaughtered on Klendathu. In addition, their plan to kill them all is disproportionate to the good they mean to accomplish. It's not like the bugs could actually wipe out the entire human race. They're not even capable of space travel. And Earth now has a defense against the asteroids that the insectoids are sending. At this point, as Johnny makes clear, the war is only about revenge, which is not a just cause. Or how about the war waged in the movie Ender's Game? Earth has been attacked by an alien race called the Formics. To prepare to attack their homeworld, the military is training children, and a young genius named Ender is at the top of their list. He accelerates through training, which involves a series of games, simulated battle scenarios. In what he believes is the final game, he commands the entire fleet in an attack on the Formics' homeworld. Despite the overwhelming odds, he manages to fire a molecular detachment device by sacrificing a large portion of the fleet to protect it, thus annihilating the entire Formic race. The big reveal, of course, is that this final test wasn't a game. He was actually commanding the fleet remotely and just sacrificed thousands of humans to commit genocide. Was this war justified? One might argue that the genocide of the Formic race was justified because genocide was their intention regarding the humans. But on just war theory, one cannot be motivated by an eye for an eye principle. One must never use more force than is necessary to achieve the desired goals. As Ender points out, the way we win matters, and wiping out the entire Formic race was not necessary to prevent another attack. Indeed, it would seem that genocide is never necessary for any morally worthwhile goal, and thus is always unjustified. It also seems that the humans in Ender's Game never even considered a non-violent solution. At the end of the movie, Ender realizes that the Formics had been trying to communicate with him, yet communication was never even attempted by the humans. Thus, war was not waged by the humans as a last resort. Indeed, it seems that the Formics' attacks were grounded on the assumption that humans were not sentient. Because they have since learned otherwise, it would seem unlikely that they would attack again, something an attempt at communication could have revealed. Ender's Game might actually also reveal a law of war that we need to add. Those who are fighting must know they are killing. St. Augustine couldn't have anticipated the possibility that someone could be tricked with virtual reality glasses into thinking an actual war was really a game. Indeed, it may only be a matter of time before something like Ender's Game becomes a reality. After all, killing others remotely with drones from a video screen today is already a regular occurrence, and Bradley J. Strasser has already edited a volume on the wide range of ethical questions that raises. We can also apply our criteria to wars in the real world, like the Korean War. It arguably was justified as a response to North Korea's invasion of South Korea, inasmuch as it was aimed at protecting innocent life from an invading force, and nonviolent means were unlikely to repel the invasion. But it became clearly unjustified once General MacArthur decided not to settle for repelling the invasion and instead invaded North Korea in response. He did not consider the Chinese entrance into the war as a result. Thus, he underestimated his ability to win. This turned the war into a years-long battle over tiny scraps of land, and South Korea ended up having just as much land as they had before the war started. Thus, the means were not proportional to the goal. In fact, one might argue that America's repelling the invasion wasn't justified in the first place. The main motivation was the feared domino theory. Once one capitalist country fell to communism, Truman and Eisenhower argued, it would start a chain reaction that would lead to the fall of capitalism. The same justification was given for the Vietnam War. North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam in an attempt to unify the country under communist rule, and America entered the war to keep the dreaded domino effect at bay. But the fear seems to have been unjustified. America lost the Vietnam War. North and South Vietnam were united under communist rule, yet it did not lead to the fall of other capitalist nations. In fact, Vietnam is now a peaceful nation in good standing with the UN. They have an embassy in Washington, D.C., and the United States has one in Hanoi. One is forced to wonder what a unified communist Korea would look like today if we had just left well enough alone, especially since the rise of the authoritarian Kim family in North Korea was the result of the Korean War. To be clear, I'm not defending communism as a superior economic or governing system. If you want to know why, check out Lecture 33 in the Big Questions of Philosophy. I'm simply raising questions about the legitimacy of curbing the spread of communism or spreading democracy as a justification for war. It might lead to good results, but it's not clear that such causes are good enough to justify war. Which brings us to our next topic, colonialism, the practice of spreading one's nation's culture and way of life into foreign lands. And to talk about this topic, I want to discuss a central principle of the Star Trek universe, the Prime Directive. To prepare, I want you to go watch at least one episode of Star Trek that deals with the topic. The original series episodes Return of the Archons and The Apple are good choices. So are the Next Generation episodes Symbiosis and Pen Pals. And if you've never seen an episode of Star Trek Enterprise, go watch Dear Doctor or Cogenitor. Whatever you watch, ask yourself as you do watch, what you would do in the situation the episode depicts. prime directive, the guiding rule of the Federation in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek universe, is one of the most famous ethical rules in all of science fiction, and perhaps also its most controversial. Star Trek is set in a future in which humanity in Starfleet spaceships equipped with warp drive that makes them able to travel faster than the speed of light is exploring and colonizing the galaxy. The Prime Directive is Starfleet's #1 rule and sets forth its restrictions for interacting with civilizations that have yet to develop warp drive technology. They can study them, but they cannot interfere with those societies, especially in their development, in any way. Examples of such interference would include exploitation of resources or labor, imposition of values, ethics, or other cultural norms, interference with biological evolution, providing evidence of other inhabited worlds, providing access to advanced technologies or scientific knowledge, interfering in religious development, or taking sides in an internal dispute or internal affairs. Once a civilization develops warp drive, interference from an outside civilization is inevitable. Indeed, by striking out into the galaxy, one could argue that they're actually inviting interference. They're joining a larger community that will provide access to advanced technology and expose them to new ideas. But before such interference is inevitable, when a civilization is essentially confined to its own solar system, the Prime Directive demands that interference should be avoided. The original Star Trek aired in the 1960s, when the negative effects of colonialism were first being recognized in academia. It's often thought that Roddenberry introduced the Prime Directive as a way to show that the humans in this ideal future he had envisioned understood the horrors of colonialism and were actively guarding against them. What we'll call the colonial period, from about the 15th to the 18th centuries, was a time of expansion into new worlds, much like we see in Star Trek, except it was Europeans, not all of humanity, stretching out into a new world. The Spanish colonized Central and South America. The British colonized North America and India. Africa, Asia, and Australia were all colonized. But unlike in Star Trek, colonialism involved imposing a new way of life on the native cultures. Europe's religion and economic system and cultural practices, its form of government, even its pastimes, holidays, and traditions. In the 60s, we were beginning to acknowledge how horrifically the natives of these regions were treated, how badly their lands were exploited, how their cultures were destroyed, and the fact that millions of them were killed, enslaved, or otherwise subjugated. You might wonder what took us so long to realize this, but at the time, Europeans thought that colonization was justified because of their own racial and cultural superiority. They thought they were civilizing the savages, not only bringing them modern ways of living, but correcting their religion and ethics. Inspired by Thomas Aquinas' concept of natural law, moral rules supposedly discoverable by anyone with the ability to reason, European moral authorities like Pope Innocent and Francisco de Victoria argued that they were justified in correcting native practices like adultery and nakedness and idolatry by making them monogamous, wear clothes, and become Christian. It was even seen as a divine mandate. Although some philosophers like Kant and Diderot were critical of this idea, thinkers like historian Joseph Ernest Renan argued that God had established a racial hierarchy. He thought each race had its role to play. Some were for manual labor, others for tilling the soil. The Europeans' place, however, he thought, was soldiering and ruling. By colonizing the world and putting each race in its place, he thought the Europeans were simply doing God's will. Today, these ideas, of course, are acknowledged by most as completely deplorable. But ideas like this can be traced all the way back to Aristotle, and they fueled the mistreatment of the natives of colonized lands for centuries. At this point, you might be wondering whether colonialism is related to imperialism. Indeed, in fact, they are so related that the terms are often used interchangeably, and even in academia, the difference between the two concepts is not that well defined. I like to think of colonialism in the Greek sense as the imposition of one society on another through the creation of a colony, either sending settlers to create colonies on native lands like Britain did in the Americas, or turning existing societies into colonies, like Britain did in what is today India. I then think of imperialism as anything that accomplishes the same kind of imposition without the creation of a colony. So on this definition, imperialism is just colonialism without all the colonies. Regardless of how you define them, however, if Roddenberry meant for the Prime Directive to ensure that the humans of his ideal future were never colonialist or imperialistic, it seems to have fallen short. That the Prime Directive fails to protect against colonial instincts is most obvious in the original series episode, The Apple, where Captain Kirk and the Enterprise crew visit Gamma Trianguli 6 and find a society of scantily clad primitives with no technology living in huts. These natives call themselves the Feeders of Vol because nearby is a machine, named Vol, that provides them with perfect weather, all the necessities of living, and immortality, which they have to feed periodically with explosive rocks. Vol's only rule for them is that they can't have sex. Given that they are immortal, no replacements are needed, and a larger population would be impossible to support. Just like the colonialists before him, Kirk thinks that he has the right to impose his way of life on the Feeders of Vol. As usual, Kirk takes the Prime Directive's instruction to not interfere with the development of a pre-warp culture to imply that if the culture isn't developing, then he can do whatever he wants. He decides, according to his definition, that the feeders aren't developing. These people aren't living, he says. They're existing. They don't create, they don't produce, they don't even think. They exist to service a machine. And so Kirk destroys Vol and their entire way of life. Kirk's mistake is twofold. First, the Feeders of Vol don't live to service a machine. The machine actually serves them. It's just that when Vol is running low on fuel, they drop everything they're doing to fill it up because it keeps them alive, just like Kirk does when the Enterprise's dilithium crystals are exhausted. When Vol's gong rings, that isn't Vol demanding to be fed. It's the sound of his fuel gauge running low. If I had a machine that provided everything I needed and made me immortal, I'd make sure to keep it fueled up too. Second, Kirk's actions are colonialism at its worst. Kirk appeals directly to the Western values of creation, production, and thinking, and concludes that he has the right to impose these things on the Feeders of Vol. But why do the Feeders of Vol need to do these things? Are they morally obligated to be inventing new technologies? Why? Their life is already as convenient as it can be. Do they need to be growing their own food? Kirk doesn't even do that. He gets his food from replicators on the Enterprise. Indeed, all the creating, producing, and thinking done in the West is done primarily with one goal in mind: to eventually produce the idyllic life the Feeders of Vol already have. Sure, they can't have sex, but Kirk imposing his moral views regarding sex on these people is just as wrong-headed as Pope Innocent imposing Christian sexual norms on Native Americans. These people's sexual lives are none of Kirk's damn business. In fact, Kirk's destruction of Vol will likely have the same disastrous result as colonialism. These people have never grown their own food, welled their own water. After the orgy they're likely to have after Kirk leaves, they're all going to be dead within a week. To make things worse, in the episode A Private Little War, Kirk actually can be seen defending a bit of American imperialism, the Vietnam War. He visits the primitive planet Neural and finds that the sinister Klingon Empire is arming the villagers of the planet in a conflict with the Hill people. But instead of trying to block the Klingons or undo the interference, Kirk decides to provide the Hill people with the same weapons. And to justify his decision, he cites the Vietnam War, in which capitalists and communists each armed a side. He asks Dr. McCoy, "What would you have suggested? That one side arm its friends with an overpowering weapon? Mankind would never have lived to travel in space if they had. No, the only solution is what happened back then. Balance of power. The trickiest, most difficult, dirtiest game of them all, but the only one that preserves both sides. Of course, as we discussed last lecture, it's not clear at all that war was the only option. And most people today think the Vietnam War was unjustified. Post-colonialism, the academic movement that studies the impact of colonialism and is almost always critical of it, was just getting started in the 60s. That's probably why its concerns weren't taken that seriously in the original 1960s trek. But much post-colonial work followed the original series. In his 1978 book, Orientalism, Edward Said argued that colonial scholars in the West had erroneously lumped together the Middle East, India, and all of Asia into one homogeneous culture, the Orient, in order to represent it as backwards and irrational, and thus in need of Western rationality and civility. In the 80s, Gayatri Spivak used Foucault's concept of epistemic violence to describe what had been done to what she called the subaltern, those who have no access to the culture imposed on them. It suppressed their non-Western ways of perceiving and understanding the world. In 1994, the Indian scholar Homi Bhabha argued that it was a mistake to divide the world into separate and unequal cultures, the first world and the third world, and argued that instead we should just think in terms of one large, integral human world. The overarching theme was that European or Western values and ways of life had been unjustly assumed superior and wrongly imposed on non-European communities, a mistake that we need to guard against repeating. And this, it seems, is a lesson that Gene Roddenberry took to heart, because you can see the influence of these post-colonial voices in subsequent Star Trek series, like Star Trek: The Next Generation, which aired from 1987 to 1994. Take the episode Justice. Picard and the crew of the Enterprise D befriend the over-amorous, peace-loving people of Rubicon 3, who kind of look like the Feeders of Vol, but are more technologically advanced. The crew discovers that they keep peace on their planet by having the death penalty as the only punishment for any crime. Unaware of this, acting ensign Wesley Crusher accidentally crashes into a restricted greenhouse and is then sentenced to death. But instead of trying to rewrite their laws by imposing a Western-style justice system on them, as Kirk undoubtedly would have, Picard simply makes a successful plea for Wesley's life. Or take the episode Half a Life. On the planet Kalon 2, at age 60, everyone commits ritualistic suicide to avoid suffering into old age and becoming a burden to the young. Now, Kirk would have given a big speech about the intrinsic value of life and the obligation of children to burden themselves caring for their parents before then abolishing the entire practice. But nothing like this even crosses Captain Picard's mind. Counselor Troy's mother, Luoxana, does give a Kirk-like speech, but Picard only briefly grants asylum to a single visiting Kalonite who wants to forgo the tradition. But post-colonialism is not without its problems, the primary of which is seeming to endorse cultural moral relativism. Cultural moral relativism is the suggestion that moral facts, facts about what is morally right and wrong, are relative to cultures or societies. In other words, what's viewed as morally acceptable in one culture is morally acceptable for those in that culture, but isn't for those in another culture with a different code. This is why it would always be considered wrong to impose one culture's moral code onto another. But post-colonialism's endorsement of cultural moral relativism is problematic because moral relativism is false. Now, don't get me wrong. I think a good case can be made that many of the things that we think are objective moral facts really are just cultural conventions. I don't think there is an objective fact about whether marriages should be arranged or motivated by love, or about how people should dress or eat, or what counts as rude behavior. There is certainly no way to prove what religion is true, and most sexual taboos are just conventions. You might even persuade me that the moral value of freedom is culturally constrained, at least to some degree. So, in the name of colonialism, many traditions, taboos, and moral norms have wrongly been imposed on native populations. But if there are moral facts, some of those facts are objective. A culture thinking it's okay to exterminate or enslave a minority group does not make it acceptable to do so. A culture approving of rape doesn't make it right, or in that or any other culture. A culture's belief that female circumcision or male circumcision is justified doesn't make it justified. So one culture imposing a moral norm on another isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily good either, of course. If there is no moral difference between the imposed and the native practice, it would seem that native populations have the right to keep their own. And certainly if, instead of replacing one of these immoral practices I just mentioned, the colonizing force imposes it, like introducing or imposing slavery onto a society, that obviously would be wrong. Indeed, it seems that these are the kinds of mistakes that usually happened with colonialism. But the notion that it's always wrong for one culture to impose its values on another is false. You have to consider these things on a case-by-case basis. A colonizing force could replace a morally bad practice with a better one. Now, of course, you might be a nihilist and reject the notion that there are any moral facts at all, but even on nihilism, cultural moral relativism is false. If nihilism is true, morality isn't relative to culture, it's not relative to anything. It just doesn't exist. Indeed, if you're a nihilist, the notion that Europeans did something morally wrong by imposing their culture on native populations and stealing their land and killing them en masse doesn't even make sense. If you're a nihilist, there is no right and wrong. In fact, the notion that such things are morally wrong stands at the center of the post-colonial critique of colonialism. And yet that notion is antithetical to the cultural moral relativism that post-colonialism seems to endorse. If the post-colonialist thinks it's always wrong to impose one's moral norms onto another culture, why are the post-colonialists trying to impose their moral norms of cultural respect on past Europeans? Maybe you think it's wrong to enslave and murder native populations, but for them, that's their culture. A better defense of the notion that it's always wrong to impose one culture's norms on another is rooted in moral epistemological humility, an admission of our inability to know for sure that our moral beliefs are true. This isn't the suggestion that there are no moral facts or that moral facts are relative, just the admission that we could be wrong about what the moral facts are. After all, many of the founding fathers were completely convinced that slavery was morally justified, yet we know that they were wrong. So couldn't we be just as wrong about things that we think we know? Well, of course we could. But as we've seen in past lectures, knowledge doesn't require certainty. So a lack of certainty about moral facts doesn't make moral knowledge impossible. And if I know that some cultural practice is wrong, it seems that I should stop it if I can, whether it's in my culture or another. That's not to say that we shouldn't be humbler about what we think we know. Thus, we really should examine our own moral rules before we impose them on others. But it does seem possible to be certain enough about the wrongness of a cultural practice to try to stop it. So, while it's true that the sins of the colonialists were vast, it can't be the case that one culture imposing its values on another is always wrong, like when the Allies imposed their prohibitions of genocide on the Nazis in World War II. You have to strike a balance and figure out when interference is warranted and when it isn't. But there may be an asymmetry when it comes to how certain you need to be when it comes to interfering in your own culture versus interfering in another. I might be justified in stopping a practice in my own culture, but not that same practice in another culture. Take the Star Trek Enterprise episode, Cogenitor. The crew makes contact with a species called the Visians. Visians are trisexual. They have males, females, and cogenitors. And cogenitors are denied a name, are not educated, and are essentially treated like property. When Commander Tucker learns that cogenitors' brains are just as advanced as all other Visians, in the name of human rights, he takes it upon himself to educate one and show the cogenitor the limitless possibilities of life. The cogenitor becomes dissatisfied with life among the Visians and asks for asylum on the Enterprise. Tucker thinks he did the right thing, but Captain Archer argues that it's not their place to tell the Visians what rights cogenitors should have. Who's right here? It's hard to tell. If Tucker had seen one group of humans treating another that way, his corrective impulses likely would have been justified. But there are a number of things about Visian culture of which Tucker is unaware that are relevant to how cogenitors are treated. Somewhat similar to how the handmaids in The Handmaid's Tale are treated, which we'll talk about in a few lectures, cogenitors are necessary for Visian reproduction, essentially serving the role of a womb. And cogenitors are extremely rare. Couples must apply to have one assigned to them and are lucky to get one after waiting years. If cogenitors were given rights and a choice in the matter, the Visian species might very well go extinct. Indeed, the cogenitor that Tucker helped ended up committing suicide rather than live the life of a cogenitor. And the couple to which the cogenitor was assigned will now never have a child. As one of the Visians pointed out, it's easy to misunderstand a cultural practice when you know nothing about the culture. But that brings us to another justification for the Prime Directive, because the immorality of imposing one culture on another is not the only reason that is cited for maintaining a policy of non-interference. There's also the dangers of unintended consequences. Take the Next Generation episode, Symbiosis. The Enterprise discovers a pre-warp civilization where the people on one planet, Brekka, have tricked the people of another planet, Arnara, into thinking they can't live without a drug the Brekkians produce, when really, the Arnorans are just addicted. Picard could reveal the truth, undo the entire trading relationship, and even mitigate the Arnorans' withdrawal symptoms. But he doesn't. But it's not because he doesn't want to impose his culture's moral rules about drug use. No. It's because, and I quote, "History has proved again and again that whenever mankind interferes with a less developed civilization, no matter how well-intentioned that interference may be, the results are invariably disastrous." He doesn't know all that would happen as a result and wants to avoid responsibility for the consequences. And this seems right. After all, given that Brekka has devoted its entire society to the production of the drug, revealing the truth could wipe out their entire civilization. Similar reasoning could be given to defend the Prime Directive's provision against giving pre-warp civilizations access to advancements, like revealing the existence of alien life or giving them access to superior technologies. You just don't know. The effects could be disastrous. Advanced medical technology, for example, might lead to food shortages and overpopulation problems. Indeed, one might argue that a species is not mature enough to handle the responsibilities of a technology until it has proven itself, so to speak, by developing that technology on its own. Even then, it might be questionable. If we don't start doing something about global warming soon, we'll have proven that we aren't ready for the technological advance called fossil fuels. But there are limits to justifying non-interference in the name of unintended consequences. Take the second season Next Generation episode, Pen Pals. In Pen Pals, Commander Data makes radio contact with a small girl named Sarjenka, whose planet is about to be torn apart by natural geological forces. Data wants to help her, but Picard initially refuses, citing the Prime Directive. Saving their planet would be interfering with its culture's development. But when Picard hears Sarjenka's desperate cry for help himself, he changes his mind, ignores the Prime Directive, and the Enterprise, of course, saves the day. And this seems right. Of course, it's possible that one of the lives they saved on Sarjenka's planet will grow up to be the next Adolf Hitler or Kanunian Singh, but one could also grow up to be the next Buddha, a space Buddha that prevents centuries of war and unites the entire galaxy in peace. Inaction can have dangerous consequences too, so you can't justify inaction in the name of unintended consequences. After all, you wouldn't refuse to save a drowning baby just because it might grow up to be the next Stalin. And so it seems that Picard does the right thing when he decides to interfere and save Sarjenka's planet. But not all situations are so clear-cut. In the Enterprise episode, Dear Doctor, the Enterprise answers the distress call of a pre-warp civilization called the Valachians, which is facing extinction due to a genetic disease. But the Valachians, it turns out, dominate another species on their planet called the mink, essentially treating them as pets, even though the mink show signs of advanced cognition. The Enterprise's doctor, Phlox, finds a cure for the Valachians' disease, which would save millions of Valachian lives, but would also condemn the mink to generations of cultural stagnation and domination. In this case, both action and inaction come with known consequences, but it's not at all clear which is the better or which is the worse. Captain Archer ends up withholding the cure because, as he says, we didn't come out here to play God. But is that really good reasoning? Well, it depends on what he means by play God. Does he mean it's wrong to interfere with the natural evolution of the Valachians because it's not natural? And that what's natural is intrinsically morally superior to what's unnatural? Well, that line of reasoning commits what's called the appeal to nature fallacy. Whether something is natural or not doesn't determine its morality. Many natural things are immoral. For example, rape happens in nature, but that doesn't make it morally acceptable. On the flip side, every time a medical doctor cures a disease, that interferes with the natural course of things, but that's not immoral. So the mere fact that saving the Valachians would disrupt the natural order does not mean it's a good reason to let them die. Maybe Archer means that there's a cosmic plan with which they should not interfere. Commander Riker briefly suggests this in Pen Pals as a reason to not save Sarjenka's planet. If there is a cosmic plan, he says, is it not the height of hubris to think that we can or should interfere? But as Counselor Troy points out, this reasoning is fallacious because without knowledge of said plan, you can't know whether your interference is a part of that plan or not. If there is a cosmic plan, she asks, are we not a part of it? Our presence at this place at this moment in time could be a part of that fate. Is the plan for the mink to be freed from Valachian domination? Or for the Enterprise to save the Valachian species? Without knowing, Archer can't use the cosmic plan as an excuse to do or not do anything. Besides, as we discussed previously, when we discussed fate, there is no good reason to think there is a cosmic plan. But if all Archer means is that it's not his place to make the call, that he has no moral right to decide what happens to the Valachians or mink, then his decision seems right. If you have no moral right to make a decision, you should just remove yourself from the situation. Now, in this case, the option is what William James would have called forced. Not making a decision is equivalent to embracing one of the available options. In this case, it's the same as deciding the Valachians should die. But it seems that if you don't have a right to make such a decision, you should simply let things happen as they would have had you never got involved. So as a guiding principle, the Prime Directive seems good. One society interfering with and imposing its will upon another is generally bad. But the Prime Directive can't be treated as an absolute rule. As we've seen, there are exceptions where interference is warranted. For some scholars, the exceptions are vast. Take Bruce Gilley, for example, an associate professor of political science at Portland State University, author of the infamous paper, The Case for Colonialism. He argues that the benefits of colonialism are often overlooked, and he cites various examples of nations that shed their colonial oppressors only to be subsequently subjected to horrendous atrocities at the hands of brutal dictators. Brutal dictators often identical or related to those who helped throw off the colonial oppressor. Something like this happened in Guinea-Bissau, for example. Gilley argues that such nations would benefit from a return to colonial rule and the economic and political stability it would bring. But as an argument that colonialism should be widely acknowledged as an exception to the prime directive, Gilley's argument has three main problems. First, Gilley fails to mention many of the horrible atrocities beset on colonialized populations by colonialism. That's why they rebelled. Without a full accounting, it's not clear that recolonizing such places would be an overall good. This oversight is why many called for the publishing journal, Third World Quarterly, to retract the article. Indeed, the board members of the journal resigned because the paper actually failed peer review precisely because of this egregious oversight, and yet the journal's editor decided on his own to publish the article anyway. The second problem with Gilley's argument is that it fails to recognize that the post-colonial atrocities were also a result of colonization. The rebellion against the colonizing power is what allowed these cruel dictators to take over. We have no way of knowing what would have happened in such countries had they never been colonized in the first place. The pre-colonial government might not have been perfect, but it would have avoided all the atrocities of the colonial and post-colonial period. The third problem has to do with the economic system forced on those being colonized. Capitalism. It can come with a lot of economic perks, but has a lot of downsides too. Without accounting for those, any argument that the West can be justified in forcing capitalism on a non-capitalistic society is lacking. And that brings us to our next topic. To explore the benefits and dangers of capitalism, I want you to go and watch an old silent film called Metropolis. Try to find the restored 2010 version. And as you watch, ask yourself what the moral of the story is. You'll see it stated at the beginning and the end, but ask yourself, what does the moral really mean?